Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll go ahead and get us started. I know we've got a few people still coming in. I'm Kellye Testy, and I'm the Dean of the University of Washington School of Law, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's workshop on artificial intelligence, law, and public policy. And I want to welcome everyone to William H. Gates Hall, and hope that you enjoy your time here in the School of Law. A special welcome to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Economic Council. We are delighted to host this forum, this conversation with the White House and with the UW Tech Policy Lab. That lab does something that academics claim to do a lot but don't actually get done a lot of the time, and that's collaborate across boundaries. The Tech Policy Lab does a wonderful job of that, being a collaboration of the law school, the information school, and our computer science and engineering department here at the University of Washington, and it is a great resource. So this event could not be closer to its mission. I also want to note that it's a perfect place to do this kind of a gathering here in the Seattle region, one of the places where we have the leading edge thinkers on various aspects of artificial intelligence in the academy and industry and also in civil service. And I certainly want to call out my own colleague, Professor Ryan Calo, one of the nation's leaders in robotics law and policy, and just thank Ryan for all he's done to bring this forward. Ryan, thank you so very much. This area is one that is certainly of growing importance to society. All we need to do is pick up a newspaper every morning and see the debates that are happening. And I've also seen this growing in importance around the country in the legal system as well. This year, in addition to serving as Dean of the Law School, I'm serving as President of the Association of American Law Schools. And all over our country and all over our world, the legal profession is grappling with the impact of technology as well. So for law and policy broadly, for the legal profession, all that we're talking about here today is so important and relevant. And I'm so pleased to see the School of Law at the table in this conversation. It's my belief that we often think about law way too narrowly. We think about it only as a system for dispute resolution or maybe in the criminal justice system. But in my view, law impacts everything, and it needs to be at the table when we're trying to solve some of our society's most vexing problems. Sometimes when I'm around innovators, we'll hear somebody say, well, law doesn't build something, doesn't create something. Well, we do. We build and we maintain the rule of law, and that's what sets and creates the very infrastructure for a society to thrive and for innovation to thrive. And so we're really thrilled that we're able to be here today and to have this conversation with all of you. It's the first in a series of conversations across the country, and it's meant to start that conversation at the very highest level. So please know that you're very welcome here. We're glad you've joined us. And I'd now like to introduce one of the main movers behind this event. That's Ed Felton, White House Deputy Chief Technology Officer, and himself a graduate of UW in computer science and engineering. Ed, thank you all. Have a wonderful
day. Thanks, Dean Testy, and thanks to Ryan Calo and Emily McReynolds and the other folks here at the Tech Policy Lab who have helped to make this event possible. It's really good to be back here in Seattle at the University of Washington where, as Dean Testy remarked, I spent 4 happy and formative years as a PhD student back in the previous century. I see a lot of friends here in the room. I see some of my mentors, and I see at least one ex-student, so I definitely feel at home here. This is where I learned how to be a computer scientist. And it's also where I met a young AI professor named Oren Etzioni, who we're going to hear from next. For as long as there have been computers, people have dreamed about making them intelligent. Alan Turing, the founder of computer science, wrote a famous paper in 1950 proposing a test for intelligent behavior, which we now call the Turing test. In today's terminology, the test asks whether a chatbot can emulate a human so convincingly that another human can't tell the difference. No computer has yet passed this test. And Turing's paper goes on, and this part is not as well known, to suggest what he called a learning machine that could adapt its behavior based on input data as one path toward machine intelligence. Since then, we've seen a lot of cycles of optimism and pessimism about AI. But the shifts in opinion were not about whether the field was progressing. They were about how fast it was advancing. The technology kept moving forward. When I first worked with AI as a student and researcher, skeptics pointed to a few grand challenges that people could do and computers seemed pretty hopeless at. AI skeptics said that computers would not surpass people at chess, but then they did. So then the skeptics said, well, maybe chess was easier than we thought, but computers haven't learned to play Go. That's much harder. And that barrier fell, or at least it's falling now, as have other problems that were once considered grand challenges. Facial recognition, computer vision, language translation. In each case, computers are approaching human capability, and in some they have surpassed us. The AI community keeps climbing one mountain after another, and as it gets to the top of each mountain, it sees ahead still more mountains. We've seen enough of the territory now to see the potential benefits that AI offers for addressing some of the biggest challenges we face. Smart vehicles may one day save hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide and give mobility to the elderly and disabled. Smart buildings may save energy and reduce carbon emissions. Precision medicine may extend our lives and increase our quality of life. Smarter government may serve citizens more quickly and more precisely, better protect those at risk, and save the taxpayers money. AI-enhanced education may help teachers give every child an education that opens doors to a secure and fulfilling life. All of this is available if we develop the technology with an eye to its benefits and with the careful consideration of its risks and challenges. That's why the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, working with our colleagues in the National Economic Council and elsewhere in the government, is co-hosting 4 public workshops, of which this is the first, to spur public dialogue on AI and machine learning and identify challenges and opportunities related to these technologies. These workshops will feed into the development of a public report later this year, along with a strategic plan for research and development in AI and machine learning. It's also why we formed a new interagency group within the federal government to foster beneficial uses of AI within government and advise on the technology as it develops. And it's why we're planning to roll out a request for information from the public, so we can hear directly from the American people, as individuals or institutions like schools, companies, trade associations, or foundations, to get input on how AI might affect the future and what issues should be taken into account in helping to shape policies. Stay tuned for more on the RFI. Our work on AI continues the Obama administration's forward-looking approach to science and technology. At the beginning of his administration, the president addressed the National Academies of Science, the first president to do so in more than 50 years, and he outlined a bold vision to support science and technology, with expanded investments in R&D, a focus on STEM education, and a call to harness science and technology to tackle our toughest challenges. From the largest R&D increase in the nation's history, to the President's Computer Science for All initiative to give every student the opportunity to learn computational thinking, to the creation of the U.S. Chief Technology Officer position, the U.S. Digital Service, Presidential Innovation Fellows, and empowering the best technologists throughout the government. This administration has delivered on this vision, and we're not done yet. AI is all around us today in many of the products we use. What we see today are so-called narrow AI systems, which solve a single constrained problem. What we don't have today, and probably won't in the near future, is general AI, the kind of broad, adaptable intelligence exhibited by humans and by computers in science fiction movies. Most experts think that general AI is in our future, but they disagree about when it might happen. Today, there's not a clear roadmap about how researchers might get there. We know that some people talk about AI as a threat in the long run, but a lot of AI experts are skeptical about this existential threat idea. What we know for sure is that AI is raising policy challenges already, such as how to make sure that the technology remains safe, controllable, and predictable, even as it gets much more complex and smarter. There are plenty of AI challenges that we're facing right now. Some of these issues will become more challenging over time as the technology progresses, so we'll need to keep upping our game. And the best way to prepare for that is to master the problems we're facing now and in the near future, so that we're ready to move on to the tougher challenges as they emerge. The organization of our 4 workshops reflects 4 questions about AI and its impact. We're here in Seattle to talk about law and governance, how we can make sure that our laws and regulatory system adjust to the emergence of AI in a thoughtful and effective way, encouraging the many beneficial aspects of the technology while coping with the new questions that it raises. As an example, autonomous vehicles may save lives and increase personal independence, but their development depends on the Department of Transportation and the states to adapt their vehicle safety regulations so that they enable responsible experimentation and deployment while continuing to keep the public safe. The second question, reflected in the Washington, D.C. workshop, is how to apply the power of AI to benefit the public. AI can help with many of our greatest social challenges, from healthcare to environmental protection, to the urban environment, to the needs of disadvantaged populations. Working out how and where AI can do this will require some teamwork. We want to connect leading-edge technologists to teammates in government, nonprofits, and academia who have the best understanding of these particular challenges. The third question, reflected in the Pittsburgh workshop, is how to make sure that these technologies remain safe and controllable. No matter how far AI algorithms advance, we cannot deploy them responsibly unless we have confidence based on evidence that they're safe. AI systems often adapt and change their behavior in response to the very complex environment in which we place them, so ensuring safety can be a tall order. The technical community must continue its important work on these challenges. The fourth question, reflected in the New York workshop, is how AI will impact the economy and our social interactions. As new technologies have always done, AI has the potential to both create new jobs and make some jobs obsolete, which magnifies the importance of programs like Tech Hire that are preparing our workforce with the skills to get ahead in today's economy and tomorrow's economy. And AI-based decision-making has the capability to detect and prevent discrimination, or to lock in existing discrimination wrapped in a veneer of algorithmic complexity, depending on how we decide to deploy it. On all of these questions, we need to take a collaborative approach. These challenges are too big and too important to be addressed by technologists alone, or by lawyers alone, or by any one community by itself. We all need to work together, combining our knowledge and understanding to get to our mutual goal of using AI to build a better society. And we need to make sure that these teams reflect the full diversity of the United States and the world, because we need to draw from the talent and perspectives of all people. This inclusive and collaborative approach has been the hallmark of this administration's technology policy work, and we'll apply it to AI as well. Alan Turing's famous paper on AI closes with a humble but far-reaching sentence, quote, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done," end quote. Today, with more experience and a bigger AI community, perhaps we can see a bit further ahead, and we can also see that there's plenty still to be done, which is why I'm so happy to be here in this room with you, looking ahead and getting to work on those important issues. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We actually have to pull down the screen now, so give me 1 second while I do that, and we'll get one set up. Unless you feel you can do this without PowerPoint.
Let me just make a few off-the-cuff remarks. I know some offensive jokes I can share. Just kidding. My name is Oren Etzioni. I'm a computer scientist. I'm the CEO of the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, which is a nonprofit in Seattle. I'm also have an appointment on the faculty here at Computer Science. And I have to say, listening to Ed talk, I didn't know what he was going to say. It really does make us feel proud. One of the most important things we do is educate just outstanding graduate students. And I think my remarks, if we do get the slides set up, are just going to be amplifications of a few of the themes that he talked about. I also, again, frankly and personally think that listening to him is a great reminder of how much this administration in a positive way that we don't necessarily hear about in the media. And a lot of the talk focuses on big topics where we're stymied, but some good things are happening under the hood.
I've never been to a conference about technology in which we didn't have a small technology snap over, so sorry about that.
Yeah, and the line we use, right, is how can you expect us to solve AI if we can't solve AV? I'm guessing that the default in law school is for people to read their remarks or to be a lot more articulate than I am. In computer science, we're completely lost without our PowerPoint. I'm sorry?
I mean, you're talking here, which I appreciate, but which one of the 4 questions intrigues you the most of what was going to be answered?
This is actually, I'll answer this. This is a great idea. We always give the talk and have questions after the talk. I'm not kidding. So to your point, this workshop was particularly for me because it's in Seattle. I'm very interested in AI for the common good, which is the mission of the Allen Institute. It's just that workshop was in DC. So a lot of the...
Or you have a mic for you back there.
Okay. While you're doing that, a lot of the, can you hear me now okay? A lot of the public discourse about AI has been very negative, and I do worry that AI will go the way of vaccines or something, where it'll get a really bad names. Ed's remarks were very balanced, right? He pointed out there's some huge potential benefits, and there are also some real issues for concern, like jobs, privacy, and so on. I believe that. I'm going to pick up on the theme of what I think about the existential risk in particular. I'll go into that, and I'll also talk about what I see as some very clear demonstrable benefits. More questions about my talk, please. So my institute is called the Allen Institute, named after Paul Allen, who's Baghdad and a series of research institutes in Seattle. We publish papers, we make open source code, we publish data sets. We also have a small incubator that actually launches companies. The most recent one is Kit AI, if you want to look it up. But our focus is not on entrepreneurial activities, it's on research.
That's the countdown to your PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. No problem. Of course. All right. And now, can you still hear me okay? Hey, great. All right. So forget everything I said. All right, I think I've said this. So what we see are these conflicting views of AI. There's the view of AI as an upcoming AI winter, right? Tremendous risks to society, existential risk, and this is typified by folks like Nick Bostrom. This is a picture of Nick Bostrom. He's at least after I'm done with him. He's a philosopher in Oxford, but folks like Elon Musk and even Bill Gates have talked about concerns. And at the same time, the head of AI at Google recently talked about an AI spring. So which is it? AlphaGo, to many, embodies this AI spring, right? It was quite a difficult technical challenge. This system beat one of the best players in Go in human history. Quite impressive. But the real question we have to ask ourselves is, what is the significance of this victory? What is the significance of AlphaGo? A leading technology executive said it quite clearly on Twitter. He says, the human race respectfully concedes and welcomes our new AI overlords. The CEO of DeepMind, right, the company part of Google that did AlphaGo, said, we landed it on the moon. So has AlphaGo reached this proverbial moon? How far does it go? In contrast, some people argue that we're really in a position of climbing to the top of the tree and feeling like we're well on our way to the moon. And this quote is from Hubert Dreyfus, a Berkeley philosopher who made this point some decades ago on a different incarnation of AlphaGo. I think he was talking about a checkers playing program. But the point is still the same. How far does the technology go? So here are the three sub-themes of what Ed talked about that I'm going to touch on. Is AI an existential risk? What are the underlying technical challenges? And then I'll end with why I'm so excited about AI for the common good. So as I said, and now you see what the picture really is of, this is Elon Musk warning us that artificial intelligence is like summoning the demon. You really have to wonder, when somebody is invoking this kind of powerful religious imagery in the context of what should be a reasoned intellectual discourse, you have to wonder where they're coming from. In contrast, Rod Brooks, a famous roboticist, said, if you're worried about the Terminator, just keep the door closed. And here's why, right? This is an authentic video cut from another. Our robots still have trouble opening doors, climbing stairs, etc. Andrew Ng, a leading AI researcher, said, working to prevent AI from turning evil is like disrupting the space program to prevent overpopulation on Mars. It's just way too early to worry about these sorts of things. It doesn't even begin to consider the technical challenges that we have getting a few people to Mars, let alone achieving that vaunted goal of overpopulation. Another point is, if AI is as bad as people say, we're going to need to get to Mars, right, just to escape from AI taking over. Anyway, there's a bunch of myths and issues that underlie this. I won't do justice to the whole thing, but certainly Hollywood has played a tremendous role, right, with visions like Skynet. And it's always the case that, pretty much always the case, that in this science fiction, AI is this evil, monolithic entity that's scheming to take over. And I think it's really important to understand, particularly again for a non-technical audience, that intelligence and autonomy are two very different things, okay? In people, they go hand in hand, right? You can have, if you have intelligent people, they're autonomous and so on. But in computers, that's not at all the case. So the intelligent, quote unquote, systems that we've developed are what Ed called narrow intelligence. They're savants. They play Go. They won't even play another game of Go until somebody pushes a button. They play Go, but they can't play chess. If they play Go and chess, they can't do the dishes. They're very, very limited. In essence, they're no different than the calculator that we all have that has a very narrow superhuman ability, but it's in multiplication. Take the term autonomous or self-driving cars. It's a misnomer, okay? Those cars have reduced certain aspects of driving, more and more aspects of driving, to a series of decisions that the machine can make. But you tell them where to go. They're not autonomous. It's not possible for hundreds of these to band together and say, okay, we're going to go take over the White House, right? They don't decide. Fundamentally, a self-driving car is not different than automatic transmission or anti-lock brakes, right? It's a set of, it's increasing levels of automation, not autonomy. The human is still very much in control. The other point to realize, and this is actually from a paper that my dad and I have coming out in a legal journal, in the Vanderbilt Journal of this, that, and the other thing, which some of you may be familiar with, Entertainment, Technology, and Law. Right. Thank you. Anyway, it makes the point that if you think about it, we can actually have a system of checks and balances with AI. Right? If you have multiple AIs, one AI system can be used to monitor or audit another. In fact, that might be necessary as the sophistication of AI programs increases. It may be difficult to have human oversight of a program. It may make sense to have a separate AI program to look over the other one to analyze it. We don't claim that we know how to do that, but this is an alternative vision that at least is worth considering. We shouldn't assume that AI is going to be Skynet. There can be checks and balances. There can be a marketplace. There's definitely multiple facets and multiple different agencies. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because what I really want to get to is more questions about my talk and this topic, but once you've heard what I have to say. So what are the challenges of AI? And again, this goes to the point that Ed made as well, which is that we keep making progress, but we keep seeing new vistas, right, and new challenges to explore. And then the question arises, okay, are we 80% done? Are we 90% done? Now we're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's? Or is it the fact that we're 10 seconds from the Big Bang, we've done some things, but this is the very beginning? And so here's my point of view. Board games, whether it's checkers or chess or Go, while they have an enormous numbers of possibilities, they're black and white, meaning both figuratively and literally, meaning that the moves are discrete. Each board position can be evaluated as to whether it leads to a won or lost position. Everything is very clear, and generating data, labeled data say who's going to win, who's going to lose, is essentially free, and it's essentially infinite. AlphaGo started with 30 million labeled examples. It generated additional examples via self-play. Think of other situations, whether it's a robotic situation where a robot has to be destroyed to get labeled data, or data in a medical context, where when you do a clinical trial, literally people die to get valid statistics, right? We're not in a position when we can afford 30 million data points in healthcare. Beyond the fact that games are artificial, discrete, and very different from the real world, there's the other observation that machine learning today, this tremendous discipline that we hear about and that we practice, is still 99% human work and human ingenuity. So if you look at what's called deep learning, the techniques that were in AlphaGo and other such systems, the target concept, what the system is trying to learn, the algorithm that was used, the design of the network that has many, many aspects to it, how you design the network, what regularization you put in. I won't throw a lot of jargon at you, but it's not the case that it's one network fits all. It's a work of months and years and tens of people to appropriately design a neural network. Labeling the data. All these things are done with people whose posture is like this. They're called grad students, or sometimes they're gradually called researchers. It's human intelligence that's driving this. So when people ask me about this, man versus machine, this epic battle between AlphaGo and Lisa Dahl, I said, no, this is human versus human. There's a team of brilliant folks at DeepMind. They've done some great work. And then there's this other brilliant, poor schlub in Korea, and they're fighting each other. And guess what? The big team that worked on this for years won. There's more nuance to that, but you see my point, right? It's still very much the case that the technology is painstakingly being built by humans. And Pedro Domingos, who's going to talk later, and I were in a different forum, and I said, we're still in the dark ages of machine learning. And later, Pedro said, no, we've reached Galileo. And being as gracious as I am, and also bowing to Pedro's superior knowledge of machine learning, I said, okay, we're at Galileo. That's still several 100 years ago, right? Believe me, Einstein has not arrived, and the technology is still very painstaking. It took months just to get from the level of beating the European champion to the level of beating Lisa Dahl, just in this narrow arena of Go. Now here's why this is even harder than everything I've said so far. Let's define a term, a well-structured problem. A well-structured problem is a problem where you can apply an evaluation function to the state of the world. An evaluation function is something that maps the world to a number. Classical example of a well-structured problem is a board position, right? You take the board position, you map it to a number that says who's ahead, which side's ahead, and by how much. Most of the world, most of the problems we have are a lot more complicated than that. You have a human patient. Well, how is he or she doing? Very difficult to judge. Is Trump going to win the primary? That was very difficult to judge. The world is just a lot more nuanced than these games. And so ill-structured problems, an old idea that dates back to Herb Simon, basically problems that are not well-structured, ones where we cannot easily devise an evaluation or an objective function. We can't map them to an optimization problem. It turns out that when we have a well-structured problem, computer scientists are so good at solving these that even when it looks incredibly hard, even when the number of possibilities is larger than the number of atoms in the universe, we figure out how to solve it. But what about these ill-structured problems, problems that we don't even know how to represent to the machine? It turns out that these ill-structured problems are fundamental roadblocks to AI. That's why when you ask this question, okay, when are we going to achieve human-level intelligence? I'm convinced that it's at least decades away. It's decades away because we don't even know what some of the problems are. Let me illustrate this with a very simple specific. There are much more sophisticated ones. Take the sentence, people breathe air. When I say that, you intuitively understand it. I can ask you questions like, well, okay, does this mean that Oren breathes air? If I ask, does it mean that people always breathe air? If you think about it, you say, well, no, maybe not if the person is dead or the person's holding their breath, so there's certain exceptions. If I ask you, okay, does this mean that people breathe oxygen? You'd think for a second and say, yeah, air contains oxygen. So just from this simple sentence, you can derive a huge array of implications and qualifications and so on, just having read this. Now, how do we represent this sentence to a machine? How do we write it down in a machine understandable language? Do we use Java? Do we use C, assembly? Do we use mathematical logic? The answer is we don't know. But the one thing we know is that the approaches we've tried to date, even including Pedro's vaunted Markov logic networks, which is a probabilistic formalism, don't work. Okay, and they don't work in a very specific sense. When we try to write down knowledge in this way, we try to give the computer 4th grade and 8th grade questions, the kind we give kids. They can't answer those. Not just our software all over the world. So I won't go into the technical details except to say that this is an ill-formed problem. We don't even know what it means to appropriately write down this information to the machine so that it can reason over it in the way that you do instantaneously and spontaneously. You can't even help it. That's how primitive our computers are. Let me just give you one other very concrete example. These are called Winograd schema. These are pairs of sentences where when you change one word in the sentence, something interesting happens. Let me illustrate this by example. The large ball crashed right through the table because it was made of styrofoam. So to understand the sentence, you need to know what the word it refers to. And people look at it and pretty clearly you say, yeah, it refers to the table, right? The table is made of styrofoam, the ball crashed through it. I change one word in this sentence. I change the word styrofoam to steel. Now the ball crashed right through the table because it was made of steel. It now clearly refers to the ball, right? It's made of steel, it crashes through the table. So to decide, what this illustrates is to decide what it refers to, you have to employ background knowledge about styrofoam, about steel, about tables and balls. The questions could be about wood, the question could be about plastic. This is just illustrative of the huge array of background knowledge that we bring instantaneously and automatically to the simple problem of resolving what it means in a sentence. We don't notice it, except when we try to build computers that resolve what it means, and the best computers are at 50 to 60% on a task that people do, close to 100%. Here's the bottom line. Common sense knowledge, tractable reasoning, all these things are necessary for basic understanding of sentences. And so when people ask me, I tell them that my 5-year-old is a lot smarter than AlphaGo, and that's not because he's an exceptional kid. He is an exceptional kid. But it's because I should say every 5-year-old is a lot smarter than AlphaGo because of their versatility, because of their ability to understand language, because of the fluidity of their thinking. Here's the thing. Deep learning, whatever that is basically a statistical mechanism. AI is not a problem in statistics. Let me illustrate it to you this way.
take the operating system on this phone, or take Windows, with which Ed is intimately familiar from a different life. Would you try to learn that from examples? From millions of examples? No, that's silly. Anybody who knows the millions of lines of code involved in this would say, no, we can't learn that stuff from examples. An operating system is not a problem in statistics. And yet, the human mind is a lot more complex than the operating system for this device. So how is deep learning going to come up with the human mind? It's not without a lot more research. And that is my point. So my answer to this, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, deep learning is not the end, it's not the beginning of the end, it's not even the end of the beginning. We're just getting started. By the way, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have discussion or that we shouldn't have workshops like this one. Workshops like this one are great, but we have time to think these things through, particularly when it goes to the superintelligence, to this notion of existential threat of AI taking over. And then the last part, AI for the common good. And again, here the mission of our institute is AI for the common good, and that's Paul Allen's directive to us, to find ways that AI can have a positive impact on the world. The most tremendous and clear example of that, which Ed touched upon and which we are not working on, is of course in terms of driving, right? So we know that there are millions of accidents, 30, 40,000 highway deaths each year, and those are things that this technology can change. In a funny way, driving is the killer app for AI. One point, by the way, that I should make, seeing John Markov in the audience, sometimes people say, well, okay, so it's AI taking over. We should remember that in all these cases, it's really augmented intelligence. It's really people working side by side with the machine. I wouldn't trust a machine to drive my car solely, and frankly, I don't trust myself, and certainly not my 17-year-old, to drive the car solely. Together, we do a much better job, and that's going to get even better as the technology improves. By the way, the same is even with what's called machine learning and deep learning. Who's labeling the input? Who's formulating the concepts? Who's choosing the algorithm? All these systems are actually collaborative systems in a very strong sense. What about medicine? You know, to tell you the truth very personally, I'm terrified when I go into a hospital. My brother's a doctor. I know the stuff that goes on there. They're overworked, they're exhausted, they make mistakes all the time, people die. So according to this from the Journal of Patient Safety, hospital errors are the third leading cause of death, and that's changing all too slowly. AI can really help here. Eric Horvitz, who's in the audience, it's one of my favorite lines, says it's the absence of AI technologies that's already killing people, right? If we're not using it to prevent these mistakes, to save people's lives. That's the reality, okay? This is not some far-flung speculation. Every year, people are dying because we're not using AI effectively in hospitals. That's the bottom line. So with these two things in mind, Moshe Vardi says, we have a moral imperative to research and deploy AI technologies, simply because when we're not doing it, people are dying. So one small example of work along those lines is work at the Allen Institute. We are working to use AI to build a better scientific search engine. Some people use Google Scholar, medical researchers use PubMed. Those are keyword search engines, and the problem with them is that with over 100 million publications and with the number of publications increasing exponentially, we literally just recently fit a curve to estimates of the number of published papers academically. It's growing exponentially. Nobody can keep up. We need the AI's capabilities to process large amounts of documents and to filter them effectively in order to cut through the clutter and find what we need to do. So semanticscholar.org is a website you can check out anytime. It's a free search engine. Right now it's only focused on computer science because we had to start small. In November we're going to extend it to neuroscience, and we're going from there to the life sciences and medical research. And it does a bunch of things. For example, it can automatically detect the results in your paper, extract the tables and figures. Maybe you don't have to read that boring paper after all. You can just quickly home in on the key results. Here's the vision that's driving this. It's not just a search tool. What if a cure for cancer or some other dread disease is hidden in the thousands and millions of papers and these clinical studies that right now we take great care to pull together and the doctors cannot keep up with? What if the machine could suggest hypotheses to us that would help us solve humanity's thorniest problems? This is clear in the case of medicine, can also be in the case of climate change. We can't let this kind of opportunity go by. And so my bottom line is AI is not going to exterminate us. AI is going to empower us. That said, we still have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
We have some time for some questions if people have them. Maybe you could step up to the microphone if you have some questions for Oren. And we have a few minutes for that. He's graciously agreed to do it.
Hi, Oren. I'm Alan Boyle with GeekWire. I wanted to ask, since we're talking about implications for law, you mentioned a couple of things. For example, the AI that's helping you drive the car. If that AI causes an accident, I think that's one of the things that people are asking about is who is sued, and then particularly in the case of the AI watching the AI, could you have AIs suing AIs?
Thanks, Alan. I thought you were my friend. So to the first question, I do have a clear position. Again, I'm not a legal scholar, so whether this makes sense legally or not, you guys have to tell me. But it seems to me that my robot did it is not an excuse. In the same way that I can't have my car or my lawnmower or whatever hurting people. If AI is driving that car, I can't say, well, it was the AI, it wasn't me. Or if I'm a bank, I can say, well, my lending program was racist or sexist. It wasn't us. We have to take responsibility for the machines that we own and operate. So the answer to your first question is it's the person's responsibility. And then the second question about AIs suing each other is probably beyond my ken, but sure seems better than people suing each other.
Hi, my name is Amy Magnus. I'm from the Air Force Institute of Technology. So you all mentioned AlphaGo. So AlphaGo kind of finds this new search space, and it could probably now help Go players play better now. So one of the things that I want to ask you is that as you study intelligence, artificial intelligence, how has it helped you understand just intelligence in general? I mean, have you gotten better at reading papers, learning foreign languages? Right now we're trying to apply that in our outreach programs at AFIT because we feel like information retrieval is one way of talking to children about how you might tackle a text that's written in a different language. Thank you.
So it's been documented, in fact, that the best chess players today, the Go results are pretty recent, are combined systems, right? Human and machine. It's not the case that the machine beats a human-machine combined system. So there's direct evidence for what you said. It's easy to imagine all kinds of places where systems can help us do better than before. An example I recently saw, the work of Maya Matarik at USC, is rehabilitative robots. It turns out that we do better when we have to do exercises after an unfortunate event like a stroke or after surgery, when there's somebody that we're interacting with. And not all of us can afford, most of us cannot afford a personal trainer to come to our home and help us do our exercises. But in the future, we'll be able to afford a simple robot that just encourages us. And her experiments showed that very simple interactions with simple robots who kind of say yay and kind of smile at you help to improve that. So I think there's tremendous opportunities for that. As for me personally, having worked on AI really since I was 18, and I was realizing the one kind of inaccurate and misleading part in Ed's talk, at some point he mentioned a young AI professor, Oren Etzioni. That was, I guess maybe that dates us both. But anyway, in more than 30 years of working on AI, I have, and I couldn't be more sincere with you, gained a tremendous appreciation for the human mind. Okay, I've written a lot of programs. I've worked with people who've written many more programs, and I have 3 kids. And the kids are so much outclass all of our software. And that's going to be true for many years to come. And so that's really what I've learned, is how phenomenal the human mind is. And let me just make one more point that's really important. We talk about AlphaGo. Think about it. 1,000 processors, a team of more than 100 researchers, and then you've got this one guy from Korea powered by a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, right? And he gives it a run for its money, right? It's not amazing that AlphaGo could play Go. It's amazing that people can play that game, right? With the huge combinatorics. Think about it. It's amazing. The human mind is the most amazing thing.
Yeah, I made the joke one time. I had my children at 40 and 43, and they asked me, well, why are you doing this? I said, they're my little pattern recognition experiments, and that was a bad thing to say.
Other questions? Yeah.
So one of the questions I have relates to what you just mentioned as the Allen Institute's scientific database that you're building. So I heard an interview with Paul regarding coming in on Monday morning and talking to guys about what's going on in technology. And somebody said in neurobiology there's 600,000 papers that were just published last year. And then he said volume content. You know, that was one of the biggest challenges. So I'm looking at your database. One of the challenges I'm up against, we're building I own an R&D lab. We've had it for 3.5 years, my business partner and I. We don't have access to data because to get data you have to pay for it. So what you're showing here, and that's one of the biggest problems I'm seeing as far as accumulating the data. So we're going out to social networks and we're contacting professors and we're getting all kinds of data. If you're making this accessible to me, and I just looked at your website, I can download a scientific document, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, so I don't have to pay for that document. So Aaron Schwartz, right, the young man who got arrested for whatever he did, that was the reasoning behind why he was arrested. So I'm trying to solve a problem here and listening to your talk here, and it's compelling. And I'd like to talk to you at some point also, but how are you doing that? How are you making it accessible to the public, you know, regarding copyright issues? Because that's one of the challenges I'm facing right now.
Sure. So again, long, interesting topic that's kind of not the topic here, but very quickly, we do focus on open access and on things that are not protected by copyright, exactly with this mission of making it as widely available as possible. But happy to talk to you more offline.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, my name is Kent Pai. I do the Voices of VR podcast. And so I'm looking at virtual reality. There's a lot of biometric data that is going to be collected in terms of people's brainwaves, potentially heartbeat. And AI seems to be based upon these huge data sets. So we have companies like Facebook and Google that have this huge, vast amount of data that we're essentially being surveilled, all of our different actions that we're doing online. We've signed terms of service to be able to agree to that. But I'm just curious from your perspective, looking into the future, as there's more kind of sensitive health biometric information that could be available through technologies like virtual reality, kind of the future of that line between owning our own data versus allowing all this data into these private corporations that are able to determine all sorts of information about us.
Right. So as I was saying earlier, I do think that there's some very real concerns about AI that we ought to be addressing right now. And as I mentioned, existential threat is not one of them. In fact, I think it's a distraction for some very real concerns. One is about jobs, and the one about privacy is a very real one, right? There is more and more data. We do have more and more the ability to analyze it in ways that might not be the ways that you'd want. So I think that is a very real concern, absolutely. And there's nothing that we're doing to solve that. Leave that to my colleagues at the White House. I can tell you that we don't gather personal data. We look much more at kind of common sense knowledge and things like that. But as you said, Google and Facebook are all over that.
So I have a question for you, Oren, and thank you so much for being available for this. And what we're going to do is we're going to have, I think, one more question today, and then we're going to take a break so we can set up our panel. There's coffee. You guys can meet each other a little bit, and we'll come right back in 10 minutes, 15 minutes later. But my question for you is about the prospect of emergent behavior, right? What's, sort of Stephen Johnson talks about this in his book Emergent. The idea that these systems, whether alone or in combination, would behave in ways that were actually like unexpected, right? And I don't think you necessarily need to get to our children level AI or much less sort of an adult AI, intelligence in order to have that possibility. And that, I will tell you as a law professor, raises all kinds of interesting legal challenges, in part because of the expectation of the law that if someone does something wrong, they did it on purpose, or at least they should have known better, right? And so I wonder if you could speak to the prospect of surprising behavior, notwithstanding the fact that people are really deeply involved and that we're really in the early days of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So again, great question, and I think it's clear that as software systems become more complex, we will see, and as they are able to make more of their limited choices, we will see more unexpected behavior, right? There have been the flash market crashes, right, that we've already seen. There's all kinds of situations where you can imagine a cyber attack or any of a number of situations where the software that we've increasingly relied on will behave unexpectedly. Dan Weld recently published a terrific essay in GeekWire. I encourage each and every one of you to read it. That talks about what if people take over the software? What if the technology is powerful and it's not even unanticipated or emergent, but it's directed by an evil actor, right? There are a lot of situations we need to think about in software more broadly. AI can exacerbate this. It can also help, right? So Pedro earlier this morning said, oh my God, I'm not supposed to say. Somebody whose name I start with P, it was Chatham House rule. But he said it before, so in public, so I can quote it. Anyway, it said, he's worried about stupid software, right? So can we use AI systems to scour and analyze the behavior of these increasingly complex software systems to look for situations, for gotchas, for bugs, for emergent behaviors that are not appropriate. So I think it's a complex and nuanced picture, but your premise I completely agree with. We are in a world and moving to a world where that's even more going to be the case, where our software is going to surprise us one way or the other. I don't think that we can solve this by somehow trying to stuff the genie back in the bottle. Hey, let's just eliminate software. That's not good.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Oren. Appreciate it very much. Okay, everybody. So we're now going to start a series of a couple of panels to get into the issues in depth after Oren and Ed and Kellye's, Dean Testy's remarks. Thank you so much again for being here. We're very, very excited to host you. We had, as you can see, a very enthusiastic response, and so for those of you who don't have seats, I'm deeply apologetic. We'll try to get everybody seated as much as we can. So I'm going to turn it over now to Deirdre Mulligan, who is an information science professor at UC Berkeley, and also trained in law, and is one of the most influential thinkers in law and technology, I think it's fair to say, writing in America today. So we're delighted to have her moderate this panel, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself a little bit more and the rest of the panelists. But anyway, thank you for your continued attention, and I'll turn it over to Deirdre.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I just wanted to open up by saying we're at this really wonderful period of time where we have had a level of engagement from the Office of Science and Technology Policy and from other agencies within the federal government on thinking proactively about how do we develop policy architectures, governance models in a way that is conducive to reaping the benefits of technical advancements. And having the level of engagement around everything from big data and machine learning to AI, along with a whole range of other scientific challenges at the level of the White House, and coupling with academic institutions, the private sector, NGOs, to think about how we make sure that technology assists us in getting the sort of society that we want to live in is just an enormous opportunity. And so I just want to thank the administration and also thank UW for helping to convene this sort of forward-looking conversation that's happening not in a reactive cycle, but rather in a productive space where we can reflect on what technology has to offer and how we can leverage it in a way that really helps us make real differences and inroads in healthcare and education and other things in a way that's consistent with our value commitments. And I am delighted to have a panel of first-rate scholars here today. At the end of the table, we have Jack Balkin, who is the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment at Yale Law School, and has been writing, he is also the director of the Internet and Society, the Institute for...
The Information Society Project.
Thank you, the Information Society Project at Yale, and has been a fellow traveler on issues around freedom of expression on the internet, going all the way back, and continues to be a real forward thinker in this area. Kate Crawford, who is the principal researcher at Microsoft Research and a visiting professor at MIT Media Lab, and also is going to be one of the co-conveners with Meredith Whitaker of the last workshop in this series, looking at the kind of social and economic impacts in AI. And one of the leading thinkers from the social science side on big data, and has been very provocative and really deeply engaged in a very critical, but I also think productive way in trying to map out some of the shared challenges that we have, and some of those I think translate very nicely to this AI conversation. And finally, our most junior, but also very high level right now, Camille Fischer, who is a presidential management fellow right now at the National Economic Council, and a recent alum of Georgetown University Law Center, where they have a joint program with MIT to really engage young legal professionals with technologists in meaning making around technology policy. And so it's a really delightful group. So I wanted to open up. Kate and Camille have both been very involved in an earlier series of workshops that the White House co-sponsored with academic institutions around big data. And there are, I think, some common challenges and common opportunities when we think about big data, machine learning, and AI, and also some important differences. And so I wanted to just open up, are there learnings from that earlier work that you think should inform the conversations today about how we think about policy, governance, and technical opportunity?
Definitely. So one thing that came out, I think actually the first recommendation that came out of the Big Data Workshop and talked about some of the work that the government had started doing was open data. So we made a push actually quite a while ago to make GPS data open. We've recently done the same thing for financial data that a lot of the agencies are doing. And I think the push for open data will influence the research to be done on big data and as AI advances. But in addition to just helping the research, there are different aspects of big data that implicate our daily lives. So I think that most people feel that they have some expectations of privacy, both in the commercial space and in the way that they work with the government. And through the Big Data Report, we really analyzed how big data impacts privacy and the different frameworks that we can put on privacy to think about it as we advance in this technical space. And so I really think some of the frameworks around privacy are fundamental going forward as big data and as AI advance.
And I love that we're connecting these two big initiatives, because certainly the fact that the Big Data and Privacy Report, aka the Podesta Report, is still getting so heavily cited, I think is a credit to John Podesta, to Nicole Wong, to Deirdre, to Dana Boyd, to others who actually hosted those events. And what we saw come out of that was this focus on privacy, as Camilla said, but also on discrimination, on sort of broader social impacts. And what's interesting now is that when we talk about large-scale data and machine learning, people are prepared to talk about, well, what are the broader social impacts? You know, is there a risk of discrimination? What are the issues around social equity? Whereas when we talk about artificial intelligence, and try to think about the social implications, people tend to go to that robot apocalypse place. They go straight to Skynet. And while that is completely understandable, because it's very dramatic, it's a part of our culture, I completely agree with Oren that I think it's sucking all of the oxygen out of the room for the things that we really need to think about, the actual concerns and risks we might have around AI. So what I'm really hoping is what we can learn from that earlier process is that we can look at the sort of the grounded impacts. Let's really assess how artificial intelligence technologies are working. What are they really good at? Where are they struggling? Where should we be careful in terms of deploying them? And interestingly, the other follow-on from the big data report was the data discrimination report that the White House just released, I think it was around 2 weeks ago now. And they looked quite forensically at key areas. They looked at criminal justice, they looked at access to credit, they looked at education, and how data is being used in these spaces that can cause problems but can also be used really well. So something that granular and something that sort of forensic and close focus, I think, is really what we need in these early discussions around artificial intelligence. And I hope that means we can talk a little less about the singularity and a little more about these kinds of concerns we might have about ethics and social equity.
So Jack, one of the areas that the administration has been looking at, in addition to kind of the desire to open up data, is also their own processes for using these tools, whether it's to open up data or to make decisions, and the impacts of both the data and the algorithms. And as Kate mentioned, the most recent report is very focused on trying to make sure that we are kind of critical users of the data, that we're really focused on some of the limitations in the data set, the biases that might be in the data because of the situations of its collection, as well as some of the ways the algorithms themselves might produce different sorts of biases in outputs. And as somebody who's focused on administrative law and governance issues as well as constitutional law, what sort of learnings do you think we have from earlier issues around privatization or kind of the private role in public governance functions that you think might help us guide some of these conversations?
So do you want me to talk about government regulation of algorithms, or do you want me in AI, or do you want me to talk about private industry?
I want you to talk about whatever you want.
All right, well, I mean, look, let me start with the first idea, which is that in the question and answer after Oren's talk, somebody asked about AI suing AI, right? That's funny, that's a joke. By the way, any AI agents in the audience today? Beep, if you're here. Very good, right? So the first thing to think about AI regulation is it's all about humans. The problem is not the AI agents, it's all about the humans. That's because the thing that's wrong about Skynet is Skynet's imagining a situation in which there's basically nobody hiding on robots, it's just robots taking over the world. That's not how it will work. What will actually happen is that human beings will basically use the technology to dominate, oppress, and basically screw other people. Right? And that's the real problem with regulation. It's humans using various technical tools to basically dominate, oppress, and be unjust to other people. So when we think about the questions of AI and regulation, we're really asking, how might people misuse the technology in areas such as, for example, credit reporting, criminal justice, in employment discrimination, in whether or not you get a credit or a mortgage for your house. Those are the real issues. It's about people using particular kinds of tools. And the question that we're interested in is, if you need to collect enormous amounts of data and use that data against the interest of various ordinary folks, what kind of duties do you assume as a person using AI tools toward the end user? That's the big question in private law. And the idea that I've been pushing is the idea that we should regard people who use AI and collect large amounts of data to process for the purpose of making decisions. We should consider them as having this kind of fiduciary duty toward the people over whom they are imposing control and making decisions. That is, the idea is that they're information fiduciaries. Now the advantage of that idea is that we don't make it out of whole cloth. It goes back to a very old set of doctrines in the law that talk about duties of good faith, duties of trustworthiness, and appropriate behavior. And if we were to apply those ideas to this problem, we would see that there's lots of important analogies between previous forms of technology, right, and how they might be used unjustly toward people, and these current forms of technology and how they might be used justly or unjustly.
So thinking about AI one of the things that it's going to need to do is collect lots of data in order to learn, right? To learn how we think, to learn how we behave, whether it's to model intelligence or to interact with humans in intelligent ways. And some of that data is going to be collected. I think, Jack, you've been particularly concerned, and Ryan has, in very private spheres, right? That these may be AI systems that are in our homes, in spaces that we consider more intimate and private. And we now have this system that we may be interacting in a way that is much more another word I have a hard time saying. They feel more human to us, and we interact with them and reveal things to them in different ways. And so this fiduciary understanding is one that perhaps would allow for a more productive relationship for people to get the benefits of that sort of deep, personalized learning and tailoring. Kate, your focus of concern, if I could frame it, has been a little bit less on that individualized sphere and a little bit more on the broader social impact, which may be not just about the use of my data, but maybe about the use of data learned from other people. And how does the information fiduciary concept relate to your concerns, or what other things might you layer on it if you're thinking about governance issues?
Well, actually, I think the information fiduciary idea is a really useful one. I think part of the difficulty we face in thinking about the large-scale deployment of artificial intelligence technologies is, in many cases, we have legal regimes that make us think as individuals. It's like, okay, these are my rights. I need to understand where my privacy is being infringed. I need to have my understanding of the system. But in many cases, these are systems that are very difficult for individuals to understand. I mean, who here actually reads the privacy policy on any technology they currently use? I'm guessing 3, thank you. Keep doing that, that's fantastic. But as we've seen from many studies, that's gonna take a lot of your life, probably a couple of years if you read all of them. And so what gets interesting with AI is we're starting to see systems that are sort of further and further away from that sort of level of being able to understand how they work. And what I tend to see when I think about these systems is I think about the issues structurally rather than individually. In many ways, the problems are structural and they need to be addressed at a structural level. And it's funny too, because we've had a few discussions already today. People have asked about privacy. And privacy, I worry that we've reached a real limit with the 20th century conceptions of privacy. That the threat models that privacy has traditionally gone to in terms of the idea that there's an exchange of PII, that I get your PII and then I process it and then I disseminate it, these classic sort of 3-stage models of privacy, have really broken down in an era where it's about mass collection of behavioral data. It's about sensors being deployed in cities at large scale. It's about, in many ways, inferring data about you, data that you're not even aware about yourself, predicting something about you that you're not even sure is going to happen. Who has ownership over that information? What are the kinds of guidelines that we use to protect that? I think privacy law is being stretched to its very limit, and in some ways is struggling with what we're seeing just at early stage machine learning technologies, let alone the AI that is to come. So that's why I think it's useful to think about these things in terms of how they affect entire groups of people and entire sort of social strata, rather than trying to solve them for the individual.
And Camille, from the perspective of the National Economic Council, where you sit, what are the sort of concerns you have about this at the social level?
Yes, so at the social level, I think a huge concern is, at what point is there quite a large asymmetry between who's collecting the data and who it's being collected on, especially when you compound each individual's data onto one another and make the inferences in that way. Traditionally, under privacy law, there was a theory that people were given notice and that they consented, and that every time you sign on to a new system, by going through the terms of service, you're consenting. But at some point, you don't have any transparency into what's actually being collected and the uses that are happening and the way that data is being correlated with other people's. And so I think that really framing the privacy conversation in the context of use and how people's data is being used and what it's being used against them for or for their benefit.
So broader social structures. So, much of the big data conversation has focused on issues of interpretability, right? So people's ability to understand why machine learning systems, why data analytics are coming up with certain sorts of outputs, right? Why am I being treated in a particular way? And what sort of accountability or redress might people have access to? And the kind of fairness, right, the kind of equity issues in the, not just the outcomes, but potentially the redistribution that might occur because of different sorts of outputs. And in thinking about AI, you know, at some fundamental levels, we're talking about systems that one hopes, right, in the future may be deeply personal, deeply dynamic, they may be learning and evolving over time. And thinking about some of those issues of interpretability and accountability, it seems that there may be some challenges. And then when we roll into it, these ideas of fairness, what does it mean to be fair if we're thinking about, for example, AI deployed in an educational context where we're trying to personalize everybody's education, but at the same time certainly have equity concerns as well. And so what do you think are some of the kind of unique areas around AI as opposed to big data and analytics?
Well, but it's interesting because I think there's been this slippage that's happened just probably in the last few years where we're starting to see this kind of combination of large-scale data collection and analytics with machine learning and AI. And to some degree, this makes sense. We're starting to see these capacities begin to really, in many ways, sort of concatenate, and together they're bringing us this extraordinary set of capacities that are equally exciting as they are concerning for these kinds of issues. So I want to be clear that when the technical community talks about AI, that can mean actually something quite specific and narrow. And I think what we're talking about here is a set of capacities and technologies that are in some ways the precursors of AI, the things that are now being built into very early AI systems. And so it's interesting to sort of look now at the way that these sort of early AI, early machine learning systems are working and use those as I think, very kind of grounded examples, because I worry that we can sort of talk about this in a very abstract way, but it starts to get real when we put something behind it. And then some of you might have read, for example, an extraordinary ProPublica story that just broke yesterday, looking at the use, and I'm seeing lots of nodding heads, looking at the use of risk assessments in criminal sentencing. And what was so interesting about this story, and it was an investigation that took well over a year to pursue because it was so difficult to FOIA those records and get that data, is that what the journalists found who did this investigation was that there was this real disparity in terms of the way that African Americans were being predicted as potential recidivists versus white people. And the distinctions were so extreme that they were saying this is a system that is producing bias in its very design. But we can't see how it's working. Of course, the algorithm is proprietary. They haven't shared the data. We don't know why we're getting these results. But they could show, as an investigative team, that there was this bias and that indeed African Americans were far more likely to be receiving these predictions. They were far more likely to commit crimes again, which would then affect things like sentencing and parole. So the reason why we've been talking about stories like this and why they're important is because these are systems that work to some degree like black boxes. The judges will look at them and say, this person has a high risk score. Okay, I'm then going to decide that they shouldn't be getting parole, for example. And it becomes very tempting for us to want to say things like, well, just make them transparent. If we make everything transparent, then everything will be straightforward and easy. And unfortunately, I don't think that's an easy answer either. Certainly in research that I'm doing currently with Mike Adeny at USC, we're looking at the ways in which transparency around algorithmic determinations doesn't necessarily show you how those systems are working and deploying over time. So what I think is different now is that we have to take the lessons from big data and start thinking about accountability. How do we keep these systems accountable, particularly if we're going to build them into criminal justice or build them into education? When these systems start to become infrastructure is when I think we have to have the highest level of due process and fairness concerns. So, Jack, I know you read the ProPublica story too, right? Yeah, and so there's some interesting issues to explore there. One, some transference among professionals, right? That typically you would imagine the judge looking at the information about whether or not this person is a repeat offender, and sometimes information about their family history and other things that might go into some decisions about
probation or sentencing, etc. And here we had a system that is, as far as we know, operating as a black box and providing a risk score, and judges seem to be using the output of that system in very different ways, with different levels of kind of reliance. And courts work a lot with experts and with expert systems, and this seems to be something that was kind of flying under the radar in many different ways, probably coming in through procurement, rather than kind of being introduced as evidence where we might have different sorts of standards. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about governance in that particular context of the criminal justice system.
So one of the things you have to understand about judges is judges like to have things that make them look authoritative. They like to use things that make it look like they didn't have discretion at all, or if they had discretion, their discretion was exercised in a way that nobody could doubt. Right? If you look at the way judicial opinions are written, you know, the arguments on the other side are without merit, always meritless. You know, there's only one reading of the case. I mean, and on both sides say the same thing. So if you look at the way in which judges actually do their jobs, you'll see that they are going to be attached to and attracted to things presented to them that basically make it look like they were just doing their jobs. As the Chief Justice says, they were just calling balls and strikes. And that there was no judgment. On the other hand, when judges find themselves having to rely on experts, right, which is a little different, judges will often, depending on how they feel, the priors to the situation, they'll be relatively skeptical about the expert, or they'll call the expert in and ask them questions, and then the judge does a certain kind of other part of their role, which is the judge is the person who cuts through all the BS and figures out what's really going on. Okay, so these two models of judging. Now think about the introduction of algorithms and AI agents into the criminal sentencing provision. It will push the judge toward the first model and away from the second model. Why? Because there's nobody to cross-examine. There's nobody to ask, right? It's not like it's a social worker who the judge can grill. Instead, the judge is presented with a number, right? Or with a correlation, or some other statistic. And the judge basically thinks, you know, this job is easy, right? Or I can make it look like what I'm doing is completely justified. Because if I reject it, right? If somebody presents me this stuff and I reject it, then I have to explain why I turned down what looks like science. And so the problem, if you want to use algorithms in this way, and I think you do want to use them eventually, is you have to build in a situation which is consistent with the culture of judging, the culture of the way that lawyers actually make decisions. And the way we've done it is rather ham-handed. We haven't, in fact, connected the culture of judgment, that's part of the algorithmic society, with the culture of judgment that's part of the legal society. And that's a really interesting idea. Each discipline, right? You computer scientists or sociologists or economists, each of them has its own culture of truth and falsity, of good and bad judgment, of a sensible way of thinking about it and an unsensible way of thinking about it. And you learn it when you get your PhD, and you learn it when you interact with your colleagues, and you learn it when you participate in a particular culture. Here's the story. Every profession has a slightly different one, and you can't assume that they easily transpose to the other. And often when you put them together without any sort of translation, then you get craziness. And that's part of what the ProPublica story is about. It's craziness.
It's interesting too, because I feel like you've just made one of the strongest cases for interdisciplinarity in the field of AI, that as we design systems in education, in law, in access to credit, that you actually need to sit and look at how teachers work. You know, how do they make decisions about which kids need more support with math or with English? You know, how do we connect with the systems that already exist in terms of how we understand the criminal justice system? That is like this sort of deep interdisciplinary question that I think you can't just do as a computer scientist in a lab. And I think the most interesting work in this space is how do we get these conversations happening across fields? Because from a design perspective, that's the core question. How do you connect with the existing culture?
Well, and going off of that, one thing that, especially the cross-examination process, so in the legal process, you cross-examine to get to the truth, but in these algorithms, it's not something auditing it. So driving research on auditing or some kind of external vetting can be incredibly useful in this field. And in the ProPublica piece especially, like the system was just embedded, then it potentially would have a different output.
That's exactly right. I think of studies like the one by Anupam Datta and others at CMU, where they did basically external auditing of how you might be looking for job ads on Google. And what they found is that but they did this by creating a giant, effectively semi-autonomous sort of network of fake accounts, and these accounts were allocated as either male or female. And what they found in this study is that the accounts were allocated as male were far more likely to be seeing job ads for much more highly paid jobs in the sort of 200K category and up, and for things like coaching services that would coach you into being able to get a CEO position. If you were female, or if your account was coded as female, you were significantly less likely to be seeing those ads. And what's interesting about studies like this is that, first of all, it just shows how important these kinds of reinforcement networks are, that if you're simply just not seeing opportunities, you can basically sort of underscore existing social problems. So fewer and fewer women will even see ads for things that are at the C level, but anything above 200K is just invisible to them. But it also reminds me that we need these sort of external audits, these capacities where we test systems from the outside to see if they're producing these sorts of unfair results.
So going back to the ProPublica story, some of the, I think, things that really garnered a lot of public reaction to this particular story is that it isn't Google's search result returns, right? This is about the government use of a system, and one that they had very little understanding of what the inputs were, let alone the weights that are applied to the algorithm, etc. And so what sort of rules do you think we ought to have, right, if the government is going to procure systems to which they offload important judgment tasks, right? What sort of things are kind of essential building blocks of accountability?
The computer scientists in the room will love this when I say, I think what has to happen is I think that legal decision makers have to import computer scientists into their decision process. That is to say, new jobs for you guys, right? Full Employment Act. Because in effect, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to create a slightly different style of culture for decision making than you had before. I mean, you can just do without the algorithms, and then you can just proceed as normal. But if you're going to introduce this kind of technology into decision making, you're going to have a different group of people in the room.
I'd second that. I mean, in previous work, I've worked with people like Jason Schultz on the due process paper, where we sort of think about where would you get procedural due process so that you could at least see the data that's being used against you if it's going to decide that you don't get parole or you don't get that job or you can't get access to credit, you can't get a loan for a house. Should you at least be able to see that data to see if it's even accurate, to see how it's being used against you? I mean, we have to answer those questions, I think, better than we have in the past. But the other thing that really excites me is looking at actually the way the computer science community is looking at some of these issues. There's a group called the Fairness, Accountability and Transparency in Machine Learning Group, which has been having conferences looking at how you might design systems to be fair. What kinds of accountability can you build in? And I think these are really important conversations to have, because right now that's not where we've been spending a lot of our time and investing our resources. But clearly, as we start to rely more on AI, so I think very early AI, there are going to be problems. We want to have accountability structures connected to them.
And in thinking about the kind of research necessary to think about how do we design more accountable systems, more interpretable systems, there's also going to be a need for professionals who can understand them and use them, which I think was Jack's point. And what sort of educational background do you think those people are going to have?
I mean, in the future, I suspect they're going to have what's going to happen is you're going to have a transformation of both what lawyers do and what administrative agencies do. I mean, if I could just quickly flip over to the administrative agency thing. When you think about algorithms in the situations we're seeing now, the stories we're seeing now, they remind me very much of the problem of legitimating the administrative state in the 20s and 30s. This is all I mean by this. In the 20s and 30s, you had an older model of democracy in which you had legislatures passed laws, courts interpreted laws and applied laws, right? Sometime around the beginning of the 20th century, people, we cannot, with a modern economy, basically make this work. We have to have administrative agencies that can create rules that can apply to lots of different kinds of new problems, including technological change. And throughout the first part of the 20th century, you get the creation of the administrative state, not only in the United States, but in other places. And this creates a crisis of legitimacy. Because after all, the people in the administrative agencies, they're not elected. are appointed by the president or by the executive agencies. And they're like little legislators. They make rules, right? Sometimes they're like little judges. They decide cases, like the NLRB decide cases. So what justifies their doing it? And so a bunch of different theories came out in the 20th century to explain the administrative state. The first one was they're just following what's been delegated to them by the legislature. Well, that wasn't very plausible, because in fact the legislature would just say, go regulate the public interest, and then they build out a whole administrative system, right? The second theory was, well, they're actually democratic because you actually can, participate in the rulemaking process. Well, that was a problem for two reasons. First of all, because in fact not everybody got to participate, but second of all, because what really that meant was that agencies would get captured, right, which is a problem. And the third justification, which is the one that is really stuck for administrative agencies, is that they have superior expertise. That is, the reason why a particular administrative agency gets to announce rules is because they're experts and they know that. And the problem with that one, it turns out, is that expertise isn't simply fact-driven. Expertise is about values as well. That is to say, when Republican administrations appoint people to administrative agencies, they're experts, but they have a different set of values than when the Democrats do. And so for that reason, you need to have various kinds of checks on what administrative agencies do. Now let's flash forward to the 21st century. Now the administrator is not just simply an expert. The administrator is an expert working with algorithms and working with big data and working with AI agents. So it turns out what we've done is we've taken the whole problem of the legitimacy of the administrative state and just moved it one step further. Because now what legitimates the use of the algorithm or the AI agent by the administrative agency? Well, it can't be democracy, right? And it can't be delegation. So the only thing you got left on the table for legitimation is going to be expertise. But expertise always comes with value. So the real question is, what is the administrative agent to do? The administrative agency now has to basically be part expert about policy and part programmer. That is, they actually have to understand the processes of the tools that they're actually using. If they don't, then basically they're surrendering their job to something they don't understand, and that's a serious problem for legitimacy.
So, and I think that is the heart of the Republic story, right? And it's not just the delegation to the technology, which, by the way, is the name of a class I teach, technology and delegation, but it's also privatization, which is another thing that administrative law has struggled with, and we're thinking about governance as, in today's modern age, involving not just public actors, but private actors, and whether that's around the creation of standards, and you can look at that in the context of security and many other things, sometimes technical standards, that we understand that there's a large private role in public governance, and right now there's clearly a transparency deficit, there's an expertise deficit, which I think Jack is really pointing to. And that's just about the algorithms. And so, Kate, I wanted to bring it back to the inputs. Because I think a lot of your focus has been to try to say, let's not just look at this one part of the system, but actually let's look at what's coming into it, and to who's going to be thinking more critically about the data, not just the algorithm.
Yeah, I have a real view on how we answer this question with the idea of training, to connect it to your former question around what kind of training do we need to do exactly that, to have that kind of critical awareness of how data can be collected and used. And I'm a big believer of thinking about how we build ethics into computer science education. I really think the sorts of questions that we're talking about here are very complex social questions. Part of this is coming from the traditional field of ethics, but it's also more broadly social science. It's how you think about how data changes value depending on who's collecting it and who's interpreting it. I mean, this is kind of like the classic work of social science over the last 50 years. I think computer science can learn so much as a discipline by bringing those skills in early on in how we actually train data scientists. Because then people are going to be asking those critical questions as they design these systems, as they collect this data. And I really have a lot of faith in that sort of the next generation of computer scientists really having that set of skills and that set of critical capacities, particularly if we build it in really very strongly now. Because there are stories happening today that just really concern me, and I see it in some of the cutting-edge machine learning experiments. I mean, some of you might have seen the one that happened recently around refugees who are fleeing Syria. And IBM decided they were approached by a client who said, look, some of these refugees are actually looking too healthy as they're getting off the boats. Could you possibly design a system that would let us know which ones are real refugees and which ones are potential jihadists? And so IBM created a hypothetical system that was basically drawing on data from the dark web to see, where you might buy passports, as well as people's Twitter likes and all of these kinds of very ephemeral trace data to try and come up with what they called was a terrorist credit score. And what's really problematic about these kinds of credit scores is that how are you going to first of all even know that if you're a refugee, someone has built a credit scoring system about you? And then how would you even check its validity? Like, where is this data coming from? But part of the reason that systems like this can occur is that it's just public data. We're just using data that's out there. We're not collecting your individual PII. So I think this is why we need bigger metaphors and different ways of dealing with these systems. And for me, data ethics is one of them, because you can't necessarily critique that refugee credit scoring system based on privacy, but you can certainly critique it based on ethics. And so that's where I think we need to really start changing the skill set of the people who are going to be basically the data scientists of the future and the AI creators of the future, because they're going to be building those systems that will be creating these scores.
So there's been conversations about not just kind of ethical education within computer science and engineering, but also Ryan, I believe, is one of the folks who's floated the idea of ethics boards within institutions. Many of the folks in the room are familiar probably with their IRB or the Committee for the Protection of Human Subjects, depending upon where you are. And many of you may have tried to avoid going through them by structuring your research in different ways. And many of us have actually had the process of, going through them, sometimes painful, sometimes very informative and useful, always making sure that these ethical issues are raised. And we've seen with the internet and social media, the kind of move of research, social science research, from institutions like this to collaborations with private industry, where the same sort of institutional processes and rules are not necessarily in place to think about research subjects. And going back to the Facebook emotional contagion study, which garnered lots of reactions from the public and policymakers around kind of the ethical commitments of institutions that are working with private data, but more importantly, could use it to influence and experiment on people in real time. And so in thinking, AI, these learning systems, at some level, it's experimentation all the way along, right? That what we're doing is learning and changing and evolving with potentially huge benefits. But how do we think about ethical systems within institutions? How do we think about ethical design in that sort of learning system where it may not be susceptible to the same sort of kind of one-off scent or the same sort of kind of fixed period of review?
This is a really tough question. I mean, indeed, sort of the current models of reinforcement learning algorithms and sort of continuous experimentation models that we see in early AI really depend on this sort of ongoing ingestion of enormous amounts of data and experimentation just all the time. And a lot of that experimentation is autonomous or semi-autonomous. So it's not like someone is sitting there and assessing each experiment and saying, well, is this an ethical experiment or is it not? So we're actually entering this new era of like really interesting autonomous experimentation without necessarily a 21st century framework of ethics to deal with it. And here I would sort of cite a particular project that I've been working on with Jake Metcalf, looking at this sort of shift to how can we learn from sort of the 20th century core ethical documents like the Edelman report that came out in 1979 and think about this kind of core values into these autonomous systems of continuous experimentation. And one of the ways we've been looking at it is we're seeing the shift from human subjects that had a sort of set of rights and capacities, this is how we treat human subjects, to data subjects, where it's actually in many cases, you're not accorded the same rights. And that's generally because computer science hasn't been seen as a discipline dealing with human data. This data is very abstract, it's behavioral, it's locational, doesn't necessarily come with sort of big ethical parameters. But that shift to data subjects is actually really profound. And I think there's a scramble at the moment to try and really define some kind of ethical parameters for how we start to use this data that even if it's been collected from devices and from systems that people are voluntarily using, they still need some sort of ethical framework around how they can be experimented on. And we've seen this, to some degree, I think, in a range of different areas. And I think, Facebook responded really responsibly when they said, okay, after emotional contagion, we'll set up an ethics review board. But how do you do that in sort of AI systems that are in many cases sort of really quite autonomous in terms of their processes? That's a really hard question.
I think, off the top of my head, one way to maybe answer that is, so most professions do have to go through some sort of ethics training. So doctors go through an ethics training, and they are under the jurisdiction of a review board. Lawyers go through legal ethics training, so
Such
questionable.
as it is, yes.
Yeah, questionable, but we still are under the jurisdiction of the bar. And so at some point, do we need to, does the profession need to gather together to create a set of standards and their own review board?
And I think that's happening. I mean, certainly we've actually got people in the room here today who are working with the IEEE to think about exactly those questions. I know people at the ACM are thinking around those ideas too. So I think we are moving that way. And I can hear lots of people in the audience nodding and saying, yes, we need to have professional bodies actually coming up with standards here. I think that would be a really strong step.
So in thinking about the potential for AI to help us solve pressing social and human problems, we're creating an infrastructure that can facilitate enormous amounts of learning, right? Facilitate new insights, early identification of diseases, early identification of a range of potential problems, both at the individual and at the social level. Enabling a research environment, in part, I think requires thinking about the kind of ethical issues on the front end, right? That it's like you want a research-ready infrastructure. So are there properties that would be useful in thinking about AI platforms, not AI abstract, but AI implementations? Take your favorite quasi-AI dream and say, what sort of things would guide its introduction into somebody's home? For example, it's an assistive robot for somebody, a child who has a disease, and they're trying to help them, for example, even advance their speech. And what sort of parameters might inform the design of that robot with an embedded AI and sensors that we're hoping to tailor educational and other sorts of developmental interventions for a child? And there's probably some this is not just a system that's here, it's a service, data is leaving the home, there's analysis going on, we're probably learning from other people's experiences, not just this one child's experience. Kate, I think for you first and foremost, what sort of things would you be thinking about around the introduction of that sort of system? The data collection, the use, the other people who are moving through the environment, the data that you might learn. What would you tell somebody?
Just a small question
Yeah.
like that, Deirdre. Yeah, I'll just solve it here. Let's do that. This would be a great place to do it. One of the places I really like to start is, what are the user expectations? So if you are using a system like Hello Barbie, for example, that's interacting with your child and it's speaking to them and listening to them and then speaking back, you might think that's a fantastic toy, that's really wonderful. What you don't realize is that's the front end to this huge data ingestion machine that is taking all of those statements by that child and then using them for a whole range of purposes. Some of those purposes might just be training the algorithm for better speech detection and interpretation and understanding. It could be also used, for example, to target advertising to that child, not just then, but over the next few years of their life. Now, without knowing how that data is being used, then you're not really able to control what happens to that data. So the expectations of use and being able to delimit the use so it's really being collected and used for the purposes that it's meant to be used for, I think is really important. And sort of starting with that so that people aren't getting these nasty surprises where they're giving up data for one purpose and finding it being used in a very, very different way. Now, beyond that, we could get into a really detailed, I think, set of principles around, what are sort of the best practices for how data is going to be used with AI agents, particularly when they have faces and names and they're treating us in hospitals and we want to trust them, we want to rely on them. That to me is going to be this core challenge for the sort of people in this room. I mean, this is in many cases going to be people who are in law schools, who are also lawyers who are collaborating with people in computer science and thinking about creating those principles in a very granular, very grounded way about where is the data coming from, how is it being used, what is a fair use of that data, and what kinds of due process parameters might we have around it.
And what about the public good as opposed to the private good?
I think we have an administration official to answer that question.
Yes. Can you frame the question just a little more?
Sure. Well, I mean, part of the benefit that AI can potentially unleash comes from being able to learn from lots of people's experiences, from lots of people's behavior, not just from one individual, right?
Yeah, no, it does. So earlier today, I was thinking through different scenarios, and I was actually thinking about what's happening with Zika virus, and drawing the parallel from Google flu and the way it was able to predict trends, but also had its own pitfalls of not scrubbing the data or seeing the fact that by reporting on the flu, more people would be entering flu symptoms into the search terms. And how you can take an algorithm like that and just a massive data collection like that and apply it for larger scale epidemics. With the ability for the algorithm itself to take inputs from this public sector through searches, but also through researchers across countries, and for the algorithm itself to be able to scrub the data. And I mean, the ability to predict where Zika is not only moving, but early symptoms before it manifests in an infant would be phenomenal, and I realize that's not going to happen anytime soon, but just like using that as an analogy. And so I think that there are exponential areas where advanced big data algorithms that lead into AI can greatly benefit the public, but there are questions of how do you use this data for its most ethical purpose, and how do we ensure that it is a public good and not being captured and utilized for the benefit of a small subset of the population?
So much of the conversation about machine learning and big data has focused on kind of the power imbalance as a lot of information is amassed by one side of an interaction and is used to influence, to inform decision making that might impact individuals who, a huge information asymmetry. But there's another side, which is we may be in the position where we have AI systems that learn things about people that could be quite beneficial to them, right? And in fact, know much more about people's propensity for disease, or the fact that they actually are showing symptoms of something that they are not yet fully aware of. And thinking about, what sort of ethical obligations do we have with that accretion of knowledge? Are there new duties that we're thinking about? If we're thinking in your information fiduciary model, Jack, does this suggest that there's not just kind of duties of care and confidence, but are there kind of other sorts of ethical duties to inform or to share learning that might be happening on the system end?
So the short answer is there might be new duties of loyalty, but I want to actually point out a different problem that's related to this fiduciary idea. So we often associate fiduciary obligations of trust, honesty, loyalty, looking out for the interests of the client with professions, accountancy, business, medicine, law, a relationship of pastor to a member of the church. So in other words, we've tied the idea of duties of trust and loyalty to professions. The interesting thing about the rise of the algorithmic society is you get simultaneous deprofessionalization and reprofessionalization. Let me explain what I mean by that. Think about LegalZoom, or think about a client, AI client that basically tries to solve legal problems, right? So thus reducing the need for a lawyer. Or think about the same thing with respect to medicine. So you could argue that it's deprofessionalized, because what it's doing is it's taking certain services and skills and taking them away from people who basically thought of themselves as professionals and had duties that were professional duties, and so they would bitterly resist the introduction of these new technologies because it undermines It undermines their guild, or it undermines their monopoly over these services, and so on and so on and so on. All right, so that's one part of the story. AI agents will deprofessionalize traditional things. And of course, that's actually tied to the whole idea of human subjects research. It's an end run around another form of professionalization which carried with it a certain set of ethics. So the first side of the story is deprofessionalization, but the second side of the story is reprofessionalization. That is, when you integrate AI agents, when you integrate big data and machine learning into these professions, you actually recreate a new form of the profession. That is, the legal profession, after you add AI, still has to have professional norms. They're just different professional norms caused by the change in the technology. The medical profession, after you AI, still has to have professional norms. They're just different norms, and different people are playing different roles in it before. And so that's the way you want to think about the delivery of these services. That these services, at first glance, look like they're basically leaving everyone to the tender mercies of the market. But in fact, if you think about the way the society that actually evolved, they would be called a reprofessionalization. That is, new professional norms that would be imposed upon people who use these technologies. What were the classic reasons at common law why, in fact, fiduciary obligations were placed on the professions? I'll tell you what they were. One, there was an inequality of knowledge and experience and understanding between the professional and the client. Do we have that here? Yes, we do. Two, there was a significant inability of the client to monitor and tell whether or not the professional was acting in the client's interest. Do we have that here? Yes, we do in spades. And three, right, there was the idea that the service that was being rendered was very important to the client. The client eventually needed it. You eventually get sick. Eventually you have legal problems. Eventually you need to have your taxes done by the accountant. And therefore it wasn't like you could just absent yourself from these services. And therefore you had to trust that the person who was performing these services for you, curing you, representing you, handling your accountancy issues, right, confessing, the person you confessed to, was not going to screw you over. That they actually did have your interest at heart and that you could trust them. And that it was a good thing that we had people that you could trust. A society where you can't trust anybody else is a terrible society. Now, transfer all of these old-fashioned ideas about professionalism into the algorithmic society. They all fit like a glove. Once again, you have a symmetry of knowledge, you have the fact that you have to trust somebody else, and not only that, you want to trust people. You want to use these new tools in ways that will help people. But if you're going to use these new tools in ways that help people, you're going to have to take on new kinds of professional responsibilities. That is, you have to produce a kind of use of algorithms which is trustworthy. And that will be the new version of professionalism in the algorithmic age.
That's a new version of trustworthy systems for those of you in the CS community. And with that, I want to open it up to some questions.
Yeah, people have questions. Please approach the mic. Yep.
So here's an issue that came up repeatedly in the panel, which is, now that machine learning algorithms are making all these important decisions, like who gets credit, how likely someone to commit a crime, and therefore how long should their jail sentence be. It is very appropriate that they should come under scrutiny, and we need to understand what are the handles that we have on the algorithms and ones that we don't. And I think we do have handles that to a large extent people aren't aware of. Having said that, what I've seen happening in the last couple of years that worries me is that under this umbrella is that I see a lot of people ascribing biases and prejudices to the algorithms that just aren't there. Like, for example, there's a very big distinction between a learning algorithm and a program algorithm. A program algorithm inherits all the biases of the person who wrote it because it's just the person telling the computer what to do. A machine learning algorithm, I can guarantee you, is mathematically incapable of having racial or gender biases because it doesn't know that those things exist. Now, those biases may creep in the data. But on the other hand, the data may also be unbiased. So for example, this ProPublica study that was mentioned several times, I actually read it carefully. As a machine learning expert, I found several problems with it, but racial bias was not one of them. The journalist is ascribing racial bias just because there's a difference in outcomes. And another example that was mentioned was, Google is showing more ads for high-paying jobs to men than to women. This is not evidence of bias. It may have had better things to show to those women because they are individuals. And the key property of machine learning, this is what makes it worthwhile, is that it treats us all as individuals. The decisions that are made for us should be a function of all our properties and not just race or gender. We, in the days before machine learning, maybe had no choice but to focus on these broad demographic categories, but now we can do better. And I think there's a very big danger of us just projecting these old issues that, people do have onto algorithms that actually at least may not have them, and we may be assuming that they do.
Sure, and I'll let other people comment, but one thing, just to take the ProPublica story as one example, right? What they found was disparate impact, right? They didn't actually say that the algorithm per se was constructed in a way that was intended to produce negative effects for one population or another. And we should do questions if we can. There are many other people. But just right that there are different ways in which bias can arise in an output, and clearly one is with intent, and I think you're right, your statement that the algorithm doesn't have an intent in any way. So I'm going to let my other colleagues.
Sure. I mean, Pedro and I have talked about this at length already over the last couple of days, and I think it's really important that as we have these debates, we need to get more and more precise with the language. And I think while some people, they're really not saying that the algorithm per se, although you can of course you can program a biased algorithm, learning algorithms have different problems. The problems there really get to the issue of the training data that they're using. We could look to the example of a recent company that I won't name that produced basically an instant photo recognition app. So you just feed it all of your photos and it would say, oh, this is a picture of a bowl of flowers, this is a picture of a room of people, this is a picture of a microphone. And then when it saw pictures of black faces, it said, oh, these are gorillas. Now, the problem with that, coming from a major technology company, is of course it wasn't their fault. They could not see this coming. This was a deep neural net issue. But what it showed in many ways, and what we assume that it shows, because we can't look in to see how that happened, is that it was a system that was trained to recognize white faces as the norm. And if it sees far more white faces, then black faces will be harder for it to recognize. So that doesn't mean that the algorithm is biased. It means that the system is actually receiving a lot of training data that's helping it see the world in a particular way. And so again, I think with these sorts of stories where we see disparate impact, we need to look at what are the assumptions that are being built into these algorithms. If the assumption is that people who have finished high school are less likely to commit crime, that may unnecessarily work against people who have no intention of committing a crime but haven't actually finished their education. So, I mean, we've seen all of these kinds of assumptions get built in, and I think that's where we need to do more work.
John Mellisbone, Chief Innovation Officer, SIC Drone. You guys touched briefly about fairness when it comes to AI algorithms and people searching for jobs. What about the displacement of workers? We probably during the next administration will see large swaths of middle management replaced by AI systems. We are seeing a lot of onshoring of manufacturing again, driven by AI and robotics. And especially at the lowest levels of our employment force, they are also going to be some of the first people to lose their jobs due to AI. What do you see as being the direction we should go for public policy?
Yes, definitely. So one of the other panels, one of the other series will go into depth on this question, but I think where we can do the most is in education. So as new systems come in, and that's beyond the labor force regulation, but as new systems come in, what are we doing to make sure that our American workforce is the best educated to handle where our technology is going? So that's through programs like CS for All. We have a program called Tech Hire, which is getting a bunch of high school and college-age students actually into big tech companies so they can get first-hand experience. And I think that there are further ways to go on adult education. And then I think the current data is 500,000 computer science jobs are open in the US, or something like that. I haven't seen the paper in a while. But, I mean, there are large chunks of jobs that are open at the moment.
So I do want to say that the labor issues are particularly on the table for the workshop that Kate is going to be. So I don't know if you want to give any highlight, but
I would just second your question and say that this is actually one of the biggest unknowns that I think we're looking at in the next, let's say, 15 to 20 years. What we know in the shorter term is that we can point to professions that are basically facing serious displacement issues. We can also look at the rise of particular types of human last mile labor, as it's called, where humans are being asked to sort of basically be the final stage on an AI system. And to some degree here, I'm thinking of the work of scholars like Mary Gray and Lily Irani, who've been looking at click workers, so we're seeing the rise of sort of humans as a sort of last mile of an AI. So AI can do a lot of things, but if it's something it can't do, let's plug that in with lowly paid human labor. So we're sort of seeing this shift in sort of some highly paid professions actually look at replacement issues, and now we're starting to see the creation of a lot of very lowly paid jobs in this last mile category. So there's some fascinating labor analyses. What we'll be doing in the final AI event in this series is bringing in labor scholars to sit with people designing AI systems to ask exactly those kinds of questions. We can ask, we can look at what's happening in the trucking industry. We can look at taxis. I mean, these are areas where we're already starting to see concerns around autonomous vehicles. But it's going to be areas that we don't expect it. I mean, programming. Programming has always been, basically as Camille was saying, this is like seen as a high status profession. Could be one of those professions where a lot of that could actually be automated. Think about it, you're already speaking in code. So we might want to be sort of a little bit more sort of thinking out of the box in terms of where we might see these kinds of displacements happening. I think it's actually going to be a very major issue and something where we need a lot more research.
So I am going to ask that the two of you each ask a question. And if you have a question, I will try to let each panelist do a little lightning round, but I'm going to ask you to ask them both. So go.
Sure. So X.AI purports to be an AI that schedules meetings for you, but Bloomberg recently uncovered that there's people that see almost all of the communication and intervene when they have to. Essentially, people pretending to be bots, pretending to be humans. Can you talk a little bit about how this marketing language in AI changes how we relate to one another and these tools?
Thank you.
So I'm a PhD student here at the iSchool, and I'm studying kind of the connection between gender, religion, and technology. And so there are like gay Christians who have been outed by their technology. And so Foster Provost talked about, the increasing algorithmic power that results in privacy loss and suggests cloaking mechanisms. And so with the mining of data and the complex interactions between data, how might such cloaking mechanisms even be created? And thinking back to what Oren was saying earlier about like AI regulating AI, is this some potential space for creating systems that can help cloaking, as well as, we're already creating systems that discover all these things and make inferences that we might not want people to know?
So Jack, Kate, and Camille, pick a question.
The only thing I would say is very simple. If you start to think that the algorithms plus professional has a duty of loyalty to the end user, then they also have duties of confidentiality. Oh, wasn't a big point. If you think that the professional / algorithm has duties of loyalty, they also have duties of confidentiality, and therefore they have duties to keep certain things secret, and that would just follow immediately from the fiduciary model.
I love both these questions. I'm going to take them in reverse order. In relation to the cloaking question, I would point to work by people like Helen Nissenbaum and Finn Brunton, who recently published the book Obfuscation, looking at the way that we can sort of hide our data trails with systems. What worries me when I think about using artificial intelligence agents as sort of cloaking agents is that it's almost sort of at the very kind of opposite of what they do, which is to sort of ingest maximal information, what Shoshana Zuboff has called sort of surveillance capitalism. Like you need as much of that data in order to sort of be earning the most money and to create sort of the most intelligent tools. So I worry that if we start pushing towards trying to obfuscate or cloak ourselves, we get into a position almost like an arms race. If we're trying to hide ourselves from all of these entities, they're going to be a lot better than we are at getting information. So I don't necessarily see cloaking as the way to absolve some of these stickier political questions. Very quickly, I love this question about humans pretending to be AIs. Guess what? It's happening a lot. I don't know if you guys saw the story about Alexa, but in the sort of very early trials of Alexa, when people sort of had the Amazon Echo sitting in their house, they were asking questions. Oh, Alexa, can you answer this for me? People were hearing the questions and then typing out the answers and getting Alexa to read them back. And what's fascinating about this is that you can think about it almost as a reverse Turing test, right? It's, you know, can we pass as AI, right? So it's fascinating and spectacular, but I think it also points to a much more serious question. One is that there's a lot of hype in this space, and much more hype sometimes around what we can do than what we think we can do. So I think we have to be really cautious not to build this up too quickly and just look and assess the technologies for what they really are. But the other thing that points to me is that there's this strange creation of very lowly paid jobs where people are pretending to be AIs. And that's not something that I think many of us want to be doing. So thinking about what kinds of jobs they're going to be and who has them, I think that's an important question.
And then on the last point, from the very government standpoint, deceiving your customers is a tenet of consumer protection. And so if a company is acting like they are AI in order to garner customer trust, that's not okay.
Okay. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. If you can join me in thanking the panelists.
That was fantastic. A couple quick things. So I let that go a little bit longer because I wanted to have a robust Q&A, okay? The thing is that we're going to take a break for about 10 minutes. It turns out that there are some students who are taking an exam next door. And so if you could be as quiet as possible when you're in the hallway, I didn't quite realize that it would be so loud for them in there. They're wrapping up in the next 10 minutes. So this last 10 minutes when you picture yourself writing a test and you're nervous, you know, but yeah, so please do stay on this side or go further away or just be quiet in the next door. The next two things are going to happen. We're going to have another panel. And then we're going to have a conversation with the New York Times' John Markoff between myself and Ed, where we're going to talk a lot more about what the role of the government is going to be in all this. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. That was such a stimulating conversation. We have to keep our game up right here. Right? We have really a tough act to follow. Maybe we should have put our panel first and then let them go after us. But
let's make it boring.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, we'll go the other direction. So far we've had such an interesting conversation, right? I mean, we've had the White House come out, OSTB come out and say that they're going to be soliciting public comments on this issue. I think that's a pretty interesting and extraordinary thing. It's not all the time that you have the White House come out and ask the public's opinion about a particular technology. I'm very, very excited about that opportunity. I hope people take them up on it. Obviously, we've heard from Oren Etzioni about how far away we are from the singularity and how far robots have to come. You know, if you're worried about them, just keep your door closed and you'll be okay. And we heard just an incredibly stimulating panel just now on the role of artificial intelligence in terms of being an expert and making decisions in people's lives that matter. Which I just think is just so extraordinary that we live in an age where that's possible, that machines can help us make wiser, better decisions and to spot things, but at the same time potentially introduce problematic aspects, whether we call them bias or whatever happens to be. At the end, as I said, we're going to have a little conversation with Ed Felton, myself, and John Markoff about the role of government. But what we're going to talk about right now is something that I find to be very, very exciting. Which is not just artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence that can touch you, right? The prospect that this is not just going to be artificial intelligence like it's just going to be software of a certain kind. It's going to be embedded in physical systems that have responsibility for you and your kids' safety, right? I mean, we're talking about cars. We're talking about airplanes. You know, we're talking about artificial intelligence that is organized to act directly upon the world. And I'll tell you, from a societal aspect, that might be higher stakes and might be really interesting. From a legal component, it changes everything. The idea that software can touch you changes, in my view, changes everything. And so we have just a great panel in order to address this set of questions. My name is Ryan Calo. I'm the moderator today. I'm not going to be taking a very substantive role, but I'm a law professor here at the University of Washington, and I've been studying issues of artificial intelligence and robotics for years. But in addition, I have Pedro Domingos, who is a professor in our computer science and engineering department here, and is the author recently of a best-selling book, Demystifying Machine Learning, which I couldn't recommend to you more. It's called The Master Algorithm. And he's going to speak a little bit about that research and the research he's been doing for years now. We have Bryant Walker Smith, who is a law professor at University of South Carolina. I don't say this lightly. Bryant is probably America's top expert on the legal and policy aspects of driverless cars. He's been working the longest on it and the deepest. He helped, for instance, the state of Nevada ultimately get its driverless cars legislation right. Deep expert in that particular issue, and of course his research branches out far beyond that. And then from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we have Tara Lyons, who is extraordinary in that she really is substantively responsible for a lot of the artificial intelligence and robotics work that goes on within OSTP, and has worked very closely with the unmanned vehicles, different kinds of constituencies, with industry, with academia, especially on the sort of drone side, the unmanned aerial systems, but really also on other aspects of it as well. And so you might hear on Twitter that her title is Policy Ninja, but in actuality she's a policy analyst at OSTP, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to have here today as well. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna throw out the first question, which is going to be for Pedro. So, I heard you say in your question before that it's not necessarily bias that we should be worried about. We heard from Oren and from Kate that we shouldn't be fearful of these things waking up and trying to kill us. My question for you, the first question is, legitimately, is there anything to fear here but fear itself, right? I mean, what should we be worried about when it comes to artificial intelligence, especially as it gets embodied in physical systems?
Yeah, so I think it's not that there's nothing to fear. I think that there are several important issues surrounding AI and machine learning, things to do with jobs, with privacy, with intelligent weapons, with the long-term future. It's more that there's been a tendency, I think, for people to worry about the wrong things as opposed to the things that we really should worry about. So, for example, we should all think about what automation is going to do to our jobs. Is it going to change them? Is it going to make them go away? I don't think we should worry about there being massive unemployment caused by AI in the near future. I think that's very unlikely that will happen. I think, for example, on the issue of privacy, I think, again, framing things in terms of privacy is a little bit taking us in the wrong direction. It's more a question of who owns my data and who has control over it, and who am I willing to share it with? This, and again, how do we even the balance of power between those who have more data and who haven't? So, again, there are some issues that I think more relevant and have had less play. On the subject, for example, of intelligent weapons, should we ban intelligent weapons? There's a movement afoot to have a UN treaty that bans intelligent weapons by analogy with chemical and biological weapons. Is this a good idea? Actually, probably not, because it's the wrong analogy. Chemical and nuclear weapons and biological ones are terrible because they kill indiscriminately. Intelligent weapons, actually, they kill less indiscriminately, so they potentially save lives. So if we ban the weapons, then actually that might cost people a lot of lives. And likewise, we've already talked about this, but we can't avoid the fact that it is a very prominent part of the public perception of AI, is this notion that machines will take over the world and will oppress us. And the truth is that first of all, this is very unlikely, because our AIs are all extensions of us. Again, the bad analogy here is that the only type of intelligence that we know on Earth is human intelligence. And so when we look at AI, we immediately project onto the AIs all of these human qualities like agency and consciousness and emotions and whatnot. But an AI can be extremely intelligent while having none of those. Provided that we set the goals, the more intelligent that the AI is, the better. In fact, the thing that we should worry about is that AI is already making all these decisions about us in the real world, like, who is the better, should somebody get credit? Is somebody a potential criminal? And precisely because the AIs are not very sophisticated yet, they make a lot of mistakes. So people worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world. But the real problem is that they're too stupid and they've already taken over the world.
All right, so I promised myself that I wouldn't ask any easy questions on this panel. So I think you're going to find that the questions are not easy ones. So, and the next victim of my not easy question is going to be Bryant Walker-Smith. So, Bryant, at the end of the day, Pedro makes the point that they're taking over the world. They're too dumb. At some point, we're going to have to make a decision about just how safe something is before we let it out. I mean, and just as a very concrete example is, how safe does a driverless car have to be before the Department of Transportation says it's okay to be on the nation's highways? Similarly, how safe does an Amazon or a Google or whatever it happens to be delivery drone have to be before we can say that it can deliver things in our neighborhoods, right? Think about that for a moment. That is really a non-trivial question, because they're not going to be perfectly safe, but they might be, safer, safe-ish. And as a computational model, we can say things about the code, but we can't necessarily know. So I guess my question for you, which again is a hard question, based on your research and your thinking, how safe is safe enough?
So, safe-ish, you probably do not want to go into marketing on a billboard. So this is a very difficult question of how safe is safe enough, and there are other dimensions too, including how do we demonstrate that level of safety once we've even established a certain threshold. Who has the burden of demonstrating that safety, or conversely demonstrating that lack of safety? And finally, ultimately, who decides? All of these get sort of coalesced into this question of how safe is safe enough. Often that requires, or that invokes a comparison. So to say, well, is the self-driving car at least better than the inebriated driver who would otherwise drive it home? Is the self-driving car better than human drivers on average over a range of driving conditions? Is it at least as good as the expert human driver in every single conceivable maneuver? Now, inherent in these comparisons is reference to today's drivers. And people say, well, are you concerned about self-driving cars? And I say, yes, I'm concerned about self-driving cars. I am terrified about today's drivers. Just like we can say we can be concerned about roboticized medicine, we should be terrified about today's hospitals. There is a willingness to accept or ignore the tragedy of the status quo and think only about the dangers that these new technologies present. So coming to that level involves a range of inputs. First of all, it requires a definition of the system. Are we concerned only with motor vehicle fatalities? Do we broaden that and say we're concerned about injuries? Do you broaden that and say we're concerned not just about fatalities on the road, but deaths through emissions, which by some measures actually are more significant than deaths on the road? Do you look at other values like mobility and access and economic activity that might countervail a pure focus on safety? These are difficult, and regulators do not have the answers. Developers do not yet even have the answers. And I hope you'll ask me, Ryan, what we can do about it.
Brian, I'm going to ask you what we can do about this situation. What can we do about it? Yeah.
Now your pledge about no easy questions, really you retreated fast.
I have an extremely difficult question for Tara, so don't worry about it.
All right. Yeah. All right, so what did I say, right? Regulators don't have the answers. Developers of these systems, if you ask them, sort of look at their shoes and talk about the need for harmonization and consistency and deliberation. So nobody really knows, in part because in some applications, like automated driving, the specific technologies and applications aren't yet at a point where the engineers or the managers would be willing to say, yes, we stand behind it, much less the entire company or regulators. And so the answer that I've come to is to turn the question back around on the developers and say, make a public safety case. Say what safety means, say how you will establish it, how you will measure it, and ultimately how you will monitor it over the lifetime of the system. And to ask these developers to make that case publicly, to provide the data that they need to make their arguments credible, to respond to the public questioning of that, and ultimately to have that public safety case evaluated not for its absolute correctness or perfection, but on its reasonableness. This is important because we need to inform the public debate. We need to give regulatory flexibility along with technological flexibility, and ultimately we need these public representations that can be questioned and tested.
So would the if the burden is on say the developer or the manufacturer to say it's safe enough, would they come up with different measures? Like, would Tesla's case be different than Google's case, and why would that be okay when today we are standardizing across?
I hope they would be different.
You would?
Yes, because what we've seen now is existing regulatory approaches are running into a wall with some of these technologies, and simply shifting to one new set and calcifying that could create the same problem in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years as these technologies change. So what we might expect is the same process we see in the development of industry practices that ultimately become often standards. To have one developer say, this is my idea, here's how I prove it. To have 5 other developers say, you know what, that worked for them, we're going to do the same thing. But ultimately to have developer 6 say, you know what, I found a better, easier, faster, cheaper, more effective, more persuasive way, and to push that, to advance that. We need, again, that regulatory flexibility to complement the technological flexibility.
Okay, well that is actually a very good lead into my difficult question for Tara here. So one of the themes that you've already heard in this short panel so far, and you've heard throughout the day and likely in other contexts as well, is this idea that the government can't keep up with technology. Law cannot keep up with technology. And so to take, my dean's point about, hey, we build stuff, we build the rule of law. Well, maybe we're not able to build it quite fast enough to keep up with other things that you all are building. It's a slower process, it turns out. But you also heard from Deirdre that, look, this is a real opportunity we have here because, from Oren's point, we're really early days here. And here we are having this public conversation, this series of conversations at a level as high as our nation's White House about a technology that's in its infancy, right? So all this is just to say that we're in early days here, and we're already having the conversation, right? So my question is that is this, Tara, a chance for the government to be proactive? How can the government be proactive when the prevailing wisdom is that, gosh, technology just runs amok and then, law comes later when it absolutely has to and cleans up? How can the government be proactive about technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really like this question. I think it ties together the discussion that our first panelist had with what we're talking about right now. Kate Crawford actually mentioned, she emphasized in the discussion earlier the need for interdisciplinarity in artificial intelligence and law and policymaking. And I think that that provides the fundament of my answer to you on that question. There's a tremendous need that we're seeing, especially in regards to regulating emergent technology, whether it's artificial intelligence systems or otherwise, for cross-sector collaboration. So that means government collaborating with industry and with academia, which is what we're attempting to do with today's session. Also the need for collaboration across government entities as well. And Ed talked about this a little bit in his introductory remarks, and we've published a little bit about this in our announcement of this workshop series, but one of the things that we're doing, trying to bring more voices together across government in artificial intelligence, is trying to do that sort of horizon scanning that you talk about, right? In identifying the needs, challenges, and opportunities that different agencies and departments face across the spectrum of federal engagement in this technology area. And then I think the third thing is directed research and development, actually, and that speaks to Brian's point earlier, which is data, right? And that is not just a need that exists in the private sector, it's a need that government has of private sector and of academia. And I think that having a concerted conversation about how to direct research and development dollars and doing a lot of gaps analysis or horizon scanning around difficult questions that we need to ask in order to provide evidence-driven policymaking answers and solutions to is a big component of that.
Are you in a position to talk a little bit about this cooperation among different agencies that Ed alluded to? I find that to be fascinating. As people may or may not know, I've argued that we need more expertise around artificial intelligence, robotics, and government, and even even more so, we need the different agencies to talk to each other, right? So, for example, the problem of safety with delivery drones and the problem of safety with driverless cars may be awfully similar from a computer science perspective, but they're handled by like two different agencies with different values and different considerations. In the case of the FAA and National Highway Standards, So, could you speak a little bit about the role of the White House or whoever in convening a conversation among different areas of government?
Definitely. So, in specific regard to what Ed mentioned. The National Science and Technology Council is a body that sits within OSTP and actually it provides one mechanism by which to have the conversations that you're talking about, right? So we convene on a regular basis different agencies and departments across a variety of different issue areas in science and technology. The Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence Subcommittee is one of those policy conversations that's now happening. There are subcommittees on a wide variety of different other subjects in S&T policy. And the purpose of those conversations is manifold and depends on the committee, but generally speaking, it provides us with a mechanized way to convene government actors around specific areas of science and technology policy. There are a variety of other different mechanisms that we use to sort of convene government agencies around specific issues. There are informal groups that aren't necessarily chartered formally in the same way that NSTC groups are, but are focused on similar issue areas and have policy conversations around those issues. And then informally, I think actually another formal mechanism, frankly, is regulation. Regulation requires, as you mentioned yourself, a variety of different voices across the federal government related to specific areas of science and technology. So, for example, the regulation of autonomous vehicles that sits within DOT, obviously there are equities across the federal government in ensuring safety standards related to autonomous vehicles. Similarly, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, is responsible for the integration of unmanned aircraft systems into the national airspace, but NASA and other agencies across the federal government have equities in that space as well. So regulation is a formal policymaking conversation amongst government actors that can help that. The last thing I'd say is that research and development actually, not to beat the horse dead, but also provides a really interesting mechanism, whether formal or informal, through which government actors can convene around a particular subject. The National Robotics Initiative is a really interesting example of a joint solicitation funding program between several different government agencies that convene on a regular basis to talk about areas of priority for funding related to robotics research and development, and also to do issue spotting in the same way that I talked about a little bit before, related to research and development in areas where we think the federal government should be particularly focused, because we need to determine solutions in, for example, deriving answers on assistive robotic technology for health applications, or autonomous systems for space exploration, or other areas like that.
Wow. Ask even harder questions then, I think, is what I need to do. Okay, so Pedro, I'm going to ask you a hard question. This question's hard because it requires you to know the future. That's what you're a very smart person. In order to ask,
that's what machine learning is all about.
Yes,
predicting
exactly.
the future.
Okay, so predicting the future. So with again, to re-acknowledge the fact that the idea of labor is going to specifically come up in one of the White House co-hosted events, the last one in New York, that Kate Crawford and Meredith Whitaker are co-hosting. But I did want to ask you something about what sorts of jobs do you see as being at risk? Okay, and the reason that this relates to a panel about embodiment is that you might think that disembodied sort of jobs, like the kinds of jobs that don't require you to do anything physical, might be more at risk because of the fact that robots are so hard and they can't open doors and so forth, right? And so you might think at first glance that, gosh, just like travel agents are having a tough time because we can use, a local company called Expedia to do your travel, right? So would other things like that. On the other hand, if we're looking around and we're looking at the state data and we're seeing what kinds of states where the most prevalent job is, do you know what, in the most number of states, you know what the highest number of percentage jobs is?
Truck driver.
It's truck driving. See, he already knows this. It's truck driving, which is a physical activity, right? It is not booking travel. So my question for you is, how do we figure this out? Like, how do we know what kinds of jobs will be displaced and when?
Yeah, so traditionally the thinking was, and in fact this is still prevalent in some quarters, that the easy jobs to automate would be the blue-collar ones, and the hard ones to automate would be the white-collar ones, like doctor and lawyer and accountant and whatnot. What we have actually found after 50 decades of AI, from what's easy and what's hard, is that it's pretty much the opposite. Blue-collar jobs are actually hard to automate because they rely on abilities that evolution spent 500 million years developing, like walking around without stumbling, manipulating things. Like, for example, construction worker is a very hard job to automate. The jobs that take a lot of years in college, they take years in college because they're hard for us, and the computers don't have those difficulties. So in many ways, a lot of the job replacement that we're going to see is, in some sense, in the higher levels. To go down, to a slightly more fine-grained answer, however, I think there's a few, if you want to ask yourself, for example, is my job going to be automated, or maybe more pertinently, what parts of my job will be automated, and what should I be doing? Because, by the way, the best way to protect your job from automation is to automate it yourself, and then start doing the things that are higher value and that you wished you could be doing. One very simple dimension is how routine is the job. If the job is very routine, it's easily automated. Another one is because you can write down the algorithm, or it's easy for the machine to learn just by observing you. Another one is how unstructured is the environment in which you're doing that job. Why did we get autopilot on airplanes first? Right? Every commercial airliner is actually a drone. It just has a pilot sitting there for public reassurance. But the pilot, by the way, the pilot is actually a risk. Right? The biggest risk happens at landing and takeoff, and the machine can learn the plane better than the pilot. It wasn't Captain Sully that landed that plane on the Hudson. It was the autopilot. Because Captain Sully wouldn't have been able to. It's just too hard. He made the call. Now, fast forward to autonomous cars, and a car driving on the freeway is harder than a plane because there's more stuff that can happen. A car driving downtown is even harder because it's less structured. Same thing with factories, right? If you're in a very rigid environment, it's easy to automate. Finally, a house robot is the hardest thing to have because people live there, cats live there, and dogs, and anything can happen. So how unstructured is the environment? Another one, very important one, is how much common sense knowledge does the job require? If the job doesn't require common sense knowledge, it's already been automated or it soon will be. The thing that we humans have that computers really still lack is just, Oren had a couple of examples of that, is this knowledge of basic things like, if I drop this, it'll fall. Computers don't know that. If your job requires a lot of common sense, which you might not even be aware of because you take it for granted, then it'll be hard for it to be automated. And the final one is, how much integrative intelligence does it require? If the job is narrow, it's easy to automate. If the job is broad, the more breadth the job requires, the more touching on different things, the less likely the job is to be automated. I think, however, that at the end of the day, what's going to... So first of all, some job categories will shrink or disappear, like truck drivers, I think, do have a reason to be worried. But there will also be hosts of new job categories that will appear that we don't even imagine very well today. Like, for example, in the 19th century, most Americans were farmers, and we don't have 95% unemployment rate because of that today. We have jobs like app developer. There's millions of app developers in the world, and that didn't exist 10 years ago. I think one thing that's going to happen as AI progresses is that there will be millions more programmers. Because today it takes knowledge of computer science to program a computer, which is a huge shame. Because only people with particular quirky minds, like us computer scientists, are actually able to program the computer. But once the computer is more intelligent, anybody can just tell the computer what to do. And I imagine that, everybody being able to do that, there will be tons of new jobs. Also, there will be more demand for example, transportation gets automated, goods get cheaper. People have more money in their pocket. Maybe they buy better houses. So maybe there are new jobs for construction workers. So it's not that we have to retrain the truck drivers to be data scientists, because they probably won't be, but maybe they can become construction workers.
So that's fascinating, and so we'll see, right? We'll see, and it sounds quite plausible. I think there's a dimension though that you're missing, at least from what I'm hearing you say today, and that is how it feels to the rest of society that a particular job gets automated, right? So I have to say that while everything you said I know to be true, that artificial intelligence causes a plane to take off and it causes a plane to land and it's safer than a person, and problems happen when people take over at the wrong time with artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, if you were to get onto a plane and you were to look to your left and you were to see just, IBM Watson right there instead of a cockpit with pilots in it, you might get concerned. You might get worried about that. And that is just a safety issue versus actual decisions with physical effects in society that we believe need to have human judgment behind them. For example, you mentioned autonomous weapons. Yes, they may be less indiscriminate, but what does it feel like to be part of a society that kills with robots, right? Or, and this is an important point that often gets missed, the law. The law is brimming with violence. I mean, let's be honest for a moment, right? There's a beautiful article in the law, one of my favorites, by Robert Cover, and it starts off with the words that legal interpretation takes place on the field of pain and death. And what it means,
This is why lawyers are so popular.
That's right. What it means is that when judges make decisions, people go to jail, people lose their property, people sometimes are killed. And so maybe it'll be more fair or less biased or whatever it happens to be. We have an algorithm behind it. But what will it feel like to people, right? And so that's something I'd seen missing from your discussion. I wonder if you could respond to that.
Yes, I think that is a salient issue. But here's the thing. I think that a lot of what's going to happen is that things that people are originally uncomfortable with, they will quickly start to take for granted. So for example, people who have Google Now, and Google Now just pipes up, for example, Siri just responds to your requests. Google Now actually pipes up of its own accord and makes recommendations. And usually, I myself, have an iPhone, so I don't use Google Now, but people who use it, often their reaction is, when they first see the suggestions, they're a little creeped out. It's like, oh, why does it know this stuff about me? But then the suggestions are usually good, and they get used to it. And now, and before long, they actually depend on it. So I think a lot of it, and the same thing is happening with, for example, pilots on planes. So some of it is just going to be us psychologically adapting ourselves to this new world of algorithms. Let's take intelligent weapons as an example. People have this very natural revulsion to the idea of a machine making the decision to kill someone. But because it's like loss of control, it's machines over people, this is all we understand. But here's the thing. If I ever find myself in a war zone, and there's a drone in front of me deciding whether or not to shoot me, I couldn't care less whether the decision is being made by a human or machine. I want the correct decision to be made so that I live. I would rather have a machine making that decision. And I think it's the same thing with surgery, right? Would I rather have a robot surgeon, with a success probability of 99%, or a human surgeon with a success probability of 98.5%? There's no doubt. I prefer the robot. Having said that, there are all these issues that we understand. We have thousands of years of experience dealing with people. And we have almost no experience dealing with algorithms. And this is why we all, as individuals and as a society, need to start understanding the algorithms, not at the level of the innards. Again, it's like driving a car, right? Only an engineer or a mechanic needs to know how the engine of the car works. But we all need to understand, where the steering wheel and the pedals are and how to use them. And here's the thing. Machine learning algorithms, AI algorithms, they also have their steering wheel and pedals. The problem is that most people don't even know that they have them, let alone how to use them. And let me make that point very concretely. Every AI, every machine learning algorithm has something called the objective function. This is the thing that it's trying to optimize. How the objective function gets optimized, that is for the engineers. They'll just do it faster, better, it doesn't matter. But who gets to decide what the objective function is, that really matters. Right now, Google's algorithms are optimizing Google's objective function, like for example, what's called the click-through rate, how many times you click on the ad. Or, Facebook is trying to keep things sticky. right? We as individuals, we should be able to say like, no, I want this to be the objective function. You are my system. You're serving me. I decide that. And we as a society, the appropriate place for us to go in and make laws and regulations is to say, look, your optimization has to happen within these parameters. And then how you do it, well, that doesn't matter. That's like making the engine run faster and whatnot.
I believe that Bryant at least wants to jump in. Yeah.
So with respect to all of your points, it goes in some ways to our definition of our systems. So for example, you may be more correctly targeted by a drone, but it may be more likely that a drone is targeting you in the first place, given that it's easier to implement. Likewise, with respect to the question of human versus machine, it may well be that the machine now is better 99 or even 99.999%, but it's that remainder in which a human might still be useful. And that's been one of the very difficult questions as development of some automated systems move up to greater automation and a less human role. At which point will the automated system be better than the human and it's just better to get the human out of the way? Or are there times when the human plus the automated system will be better and you have to make an argument to keep the human in? It may well be that automation itself doesn't make the roads much safer. It may be that automation enables people to accept more safety features that ultimately improve safety. Job is not a singular task. So we have all become secretaries, we have all become travel agents, we have all become schedulers as part of our normal job, and some of those discrete jobs have gone away. So it's interesting to me as automation makes some of those functions even more expedient, if it's not that job categories will go away, but simply we'll need less of us for any job because we're each more efficient.
Well, I think both of the possibilities will happen, right? So for example, there has been these books written about how, well, it's dangerous when, the pilots don't have practice anymore, right? And so when they're called on to fly the plane, they're rusty. So maybe they should fly the plane more often. I think that in cases like that, we just need to get the human completely out of the loop. Some jobs are better just purely done by computers. But I think for most people's jobs, what's going to happen is the job is best done by a combination of a human and a computer. A very interesting example in this regard is chess, right? So, one day Deep Blue beat Kasparov, and ever since then, computers, dominated chess on the planet. Not true. The best chess players on the planet are actually not computers. They're teams of humans and computers, which are called centaurs in the community. And I think the same thing is going to apply to the majority of jobs. So, automation is it's like having a horse, right? If you have a horse, you don't try to outrun the horse, you ride the horse. And because you ride the horse, you go farther. So this is the way that we should be thinking about it, not human versus machine.
Deirdre, did you want to jump in? Because I have another question if not.
Go for it.
Okay, go for it. All right, so my next question has to do with, look, there's 4 of these White House things. This one is about law and policy, right? And I'm a law professor, so I'm going to start asking some law questions. And if those of you are uncomfortable, you can leave. There's people that want to sit down over there. No, I'm just kidding. What about this question of who is responsible, right? So when you have teams, centaurs, who won, right? But if something goes wrong, who lost? What do we do about this question of liability? Oren said something very interesting, very provocative at the beginning of the day, which was that, look, let's not try to offload responsibility onto the system. It's the system, at the end of the day who's responsible, it's the person at the end of the day who's responsible, not the system. But I guess I'm not sure that I see that at all, right? So as you take people out of the loop, whether it's in warfare, whether it's in driving, flying, whatever happens to be, it seems to me that the case gets weaker and weaker and weaker that the liability should reside in a person, and that your analogy about riding a horse breaks down because really the horse is doing so much that, if anything, it's the people that built and trained the horse that would be responsible and not the individual.
But you can't sue God.
You can't sue God, right? Well, it's interesting. You in tort law, which is what I teach.
Or evolution, you can't sue evolution.
Yeah. Well, there was a big evolution trial, but evolution was on trial
for a different reason.
For a different reason. Okay, fair enough. All right, but I wondered if anyone wanted to speak to this question of, how do we allocate liability in an age where it's these teams or the humans getting taken out of the loop entirely? We can start with whoever.
I think this is a very good question. In fact, I disagree with Oren on this. I think there's a simple rule, which is whoever really made the decision is who is liable. And for example, let's say that what you have is an automated car that was programmed, right? It's the company that made the car that is liable. And I think, Volvo has already said we will be liable for for whatever, accidents our car causes.
But
And in
Tesla says we're not liable.
No, I know, but I'm saying like Volvo is right, Tesla is wrong. I mean, a little bit black and white, but but I think in the long term what we're going to see is that it's the Volvo model that's going to prevail in things like driving a car. Also because that is a very easy model to insure, and the better locus of the insurance is the company because it owns a lot of cars or made a lot of cars. The risks are predictable. Now, if the person is driving the car, right, then they are responsible. And for example, if I'm riding a horse, unless the horse, did something strange, I'm actually responsible for what the horse does. Where things get really interesting, and they are getting really interesting, is what happens when the car was learning after it was given to the customer. Mm-hmm. Google's cars, they learned a lot, millions of hours of driving, before the car was given to the customer. I think the company is liable for that and has to be. But what happens if the car did something wrong because of something that it learned while watching the human drive? This is not a hypothetical example. Yeah. I think this is where things get interesting.
All right, so we have Tara, I have a question specifically for you, but I also would love your thoughts about this particular question. Do you want to jump in and then we'll go to Brian?
Sure, yeah. So I don't have a legal background, so the caveat that is the case. I think the answer to these questions are really, really complicated. And I don't mean to punt, but I just to throw a wrench in the cogs. Another example, theoretical example, is when the software provider is different from the hardware provider. Who is liable in that case? When you buy the car from a specific manufacturer, but in fact the software that maybe had a bug was provided by a different party. So
then if the software had a bug, then it's the software.
Fair enough. But you could go on and on with theoreticals like this, right? So I think it's really challenging to answer these questions. And again, I don't deal expressly with legal issues related to liability challenges, but I think they're fascinating conversations to have.
Well, I mean, to some extent, of course, regulation can affect the liability calculus, right? I mean, if you're not doing what NISTA tells you need to do, then you're very, very likely to get sued. But Brian, let's have you come in.
Sure. So I do have a legal background. The caveat is I don't work at the White House. So take that as a given. Liability is one of those really appealing words that gets thrown out almost as a stand-in, I think, for a sense of fear or moral judgment or excitement by the public. That is, if we can say who's liable, we must have solved the problem, right? And we can condemn someone and go home happy. Liability can be criminal or civil. Criminal is pretty straightforward because often we require culpability. If you don't have control over something in a meaningful sense, you're not going to be culpable. The civil, we talk about liability in the sense of compensation and deterrence. And so the first question is, what do we want liability to do? Are we trying to compensate people, or are we trying to regulate through the operation of our rules of liability? And then we can say, are we talking about how law will work? That's the descriptive question, or how law should work? That's the normative question. And I think the suggestion that we have some other framework was very normative. The descriptive question is actually pretty easy. And that is, it depends. If Ryan and I are both driving and our cars collide, you could ask, who's liable? And the obvious answer is it's Ryan, because it's not me. The obvious answer is it depends. It depends on what Ryan was doing, what I was doing, whether our cars were properly maintained, whether we were alert, what caused the crash. And the same factual inquiry will matter for any of these future cases. Was the user properly instructed? Were they complying with instructions? Had they properly maintained the system? Was the data supplied to the system correct? Did the system make a correct decision using the data? What values were taken into account? What were not? What was the alternative that should have happened? And those kinds of individualized determinations will shape the liability outcome.
So, it's hard to ignore the fact that the couple contexts in which robotics has really flourished, robotics being in a sense the embodiment of artificial intelligence, is a little bit of a controversial claim I'm making, but let's work with it. The places that robotics has flourished have been in zones where liability was actually domesticated in some way. So for example, in the factory, right? So for decades now, decades, we have had a tremendous amount of automation in factories, right? But that's a place where it's a very bounded universe, and you have to stay outside of the kill zone. And also, we have workers' compensation, right? Another area that we've had just a massive robotization, just massive amount of robotics, is in the theater of war, in the military. But because of the way that the government purchases weapons, it does so according to extremely specific guidelines, and therefore the people that make those, as long as they abide by the guidelines, are not actually ultimately held responsible for problems with those systems. It occurs to me, Tara, that there's the fact that the government might have a special context in terms of liability would make it an interesting place to start to deploy some of these systems. For example, if we wanted to figure out whether cars could be driverless, let's make mail trucks driverless, because the Postal Service is immunized for negligence on the road. You know what I mean? Now that might be controversial, but that's the state of it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the government as a user of technology and as a procurer of technology, and how that might interact with the legal affordances here.
Yeah, I like the mail truck idea, first of all.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of examples that I guess I can deploy in where this is already happening. And actually, UAS, unmanned aircraft systems, is surprisingly to a lot of people one of them. So the U.S. government, a lot of people know and associate with use of unmanned aircraft systems in a military context. But I want to talk about the civil or non-military context. And one example of that is actually the Department of the Interior, which is doing amazing work in testing systems of UAS and actually deploying them to advance agency missions. So DOI actually manages 1/5 of all U.S. land, which is pretty incredible. And they're now they're doing a lot of the land and environmental management and wildlife management on those public lands using unmanned systems. And they actually, in many cases, are doing this testing with surplus military aircraft that they procure for free. They've seen incredible cost reductions across a variety of different mission operations. They're doing, they're saving lives, increasing cost efficiency, and increasing mission efficiency with these vehicles to the tune of several hundreds of, potentially billions of dollars of taxpayer money and several lives over the course of X number of years. We haven't really been able to determine the statistics because the systems haven't been deployed for long enough for us to do so, but they're using them for 24-hour firefighting, they're using them for wildlife management, they're using them for environmental analysis, and they're just one of many examples of other agencies doing incredible work, including NOAA and others. Even USAID is thinking about deploying UAS operations. So these are just some examples of government as users. And the reason why it's relevant to this question is because public operators under current regulatory regime actually have different rules than commercial or private operators. And so they get what's called essentially a certificate of authorization, a COA from the FAA under current regulation, and they're allowed to do things that other entities probably would not be able to do. So DOI's exercises are one example of that. Related to procurement, that's another really good point. I think that given the use of the government, the use of these platforms by the government, we are learning a lot of really important lessons early on about things that we wouldn't maybe perhaps otherwise know. And that includes, again, in procurement issues, in issues of data standardization and interoperability across agencies and government entities, but also within agencies and organizations. We're learning things about training and certification related to the operators of these vehicles because, although we are talking about AI, a lot of these systems aren't truly autonomous in the ways that we might describe computational AI to be in some cases. And then also in operations improvements. So government as early user is actually it's an amazing thing to shine a light on. It's a story that a lot of people don't know very much about. And the government's actually doing incredible work at the bleeding edge of technology in some cases, which we're not always known for. So it's always nice to have an excuse to tell those stories.
Yeah, I think John Markoff's book, Machines of Love and Grace, tells that story about the bleeding edge being largely often the government.
But to separate that from the question of liability,
yeah.
Because the impact of liability on both safety and innovation are empirically contested questions. The Postal Service actually pays out millions every year to settle claims. I FOIA'd the data.
Oh, wow, okay.
And because of the Claims Act. And so if immunization were to inspire innovation, then we would expect even more innovation from the government than you've already described.
Yeah. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but this has already been 50 minutes already. For me, it went very, very fast. And I want to make sure that the audience gets a chance to ask your questions of this group of experts. So if you would come down and stand before the mic, I can take turns. Yeah, please,
Hi.
Nick.
I'm Nick Restoff. My question has to do with this issue of liability, because I hear us working over something that's very commonplace in the law. Can you use AI or deep learning to prevent liability? Does anybody know of an application?
Only insofar as if you can make systems safer, that's the best way to avoid liability for injuries, because you avoid the injury in the first place. But I think you're describing something else.
Well, it could be, let's say, employment discrimination. Can you use deep learning for that purpose? Anybody know of an example?
I mean, I don't think so, because learning systems are fallible. They often fail in different ways than people do, but they are also fallible.
Can they be used to identify risk?
No,
liability?
no, they can't. So I know that is the whole point. Is that hopefully for example, the AI system will do a better job than a human would have, for example, in reducing liability, discriminating less, etc., etc. But we can't take it for granted, and sometimes it will go wrong. And liability is I don't think it's ever going to disappear.
Peter, can we get you in here?
Yeah, I had a question for Pedro.
Is that not on?
How's this? Yes? No.
It was working a minute ago. Yeah.
I have a question for Pedro. So you advocate the transition from militaries that use humans on the battlefield to the use of robots, because the robots may have better judgment in the heat of battle. But we've had several kind of whistles blown or alarms sounded about the use of drones in the war on terror. Civil society in Yemen and former US drone operators have come out in public and said the use of drones are recruiting tools for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because the perceived injustice of losing an innocent family member to a robot is somehow much greater than the perceived injustice of losing someone in traditional warfare. And they're saying these organizations, terrorist organizations, are recruiting much faster because of the use of drones. Is that plausible? And how should that be factored?
To the best of my understanding, actually, drones in something like the war on terror, or more generally, fighting guerrilla armies that are on the opposite side of the border, are a huge net plus. Because the alternative, of course, Al-Qaeda will use whatever goes wrong as a recruiting tool, as they would in any circumstance. The question is how much goes wrong in each case. And the thing is, before there were drones, like when the guerrillas ran across the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan, you had two choices. One was you left them alone, in which case they will continue doing their thing, right? Or you actually invaded Pakistan, which would kill a lot more people and be a much bigger propaganda weapon than using drones. So I think it's good to keep an eye on these things, but I think drones are actually a huge net positive. And another huge issue, which I think we need to also consider, is every time that you replace a human soldier by a robot on the battlefield, you're taking humans out of harm's way. We have an ethical responsibility to replace our soldiers with robots whenever we can. In fact, what I hope happens is that there won't be a Geneva Convention banning robots in combat. There'll be a Geneva Convention banning humans in combat.
The other thing I would add to that very provocative remark is, Peter, is that obviously drones are controlled by people, by teams of 3 or 4 people, and so where the perception might be it's this inscrutable robot, it's not a discrimination decision being made by a machine itself. It's actually people, and so when people take out I don't mean to be at all flip about this, but when people take out a wedding instead of the intended target, it's people doing that, right? Anyway, thanks for your great question. Please.
Hi, my name is Nico. I'm the co-founder of the AI initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I'm also affiliated with the Science, Technology, and Policy program over there. And my question goes like this. I think that this panel mirrors, in fact, what Kate and Jack have been saying before, in how there is an interesting traffic across the boundary of expertise and across the boundary of democracy. We've been hearing a lot about regulation, which is generally reserved to so-called technical matter, and not so much about governance, which is supposed to be the matter of policy, political stuff. And putting on the side superintelligence, looking at the next 10, 15 years, I think we have enough on the table to say that we have some serious political implications over here. And when I look at the institutional framework that this country operates in, I see a confusion. Well, we've been talking about governments only implying that it's the federal government, the executive branch, while any of the decisions and changes that would have to be made to adjust this society to whatever kind of loss of jobs or need for education will be done through Congress, for example. And I'm worried because I don't see the kind of tools within Congress like the OSTP. We used to have the OTA, which was abolished in 1995, and I'm wondering, and I want to ask the panel about what can be done to enhance the apparatus, to enhance the tools beyond the executive branch, which seems to be quite solid, to deal with the political changes that are lying ahead of us.
I think Congress should bring back the Office of Technology Assessment. This is a wonderful thing that they had, and they need it now more than ever. Unfortunately, they abolished at one point. And the net cost of that is far bigger than the cost of OTA. So bring back the OTA, I think, is a very simple first step.
I've argued that there should be a federal robotics commission that has an advisory role across all branches in the state government and potentially the courts as well. I like to call it a federal robotics commission because I think it has some cachet associated with it. Bruce Schneier has argued for a Bureau of Cyber Physical Systems, and you tell me what you'd rather work for, the Federal Robotics Commission or the Bureau of Cyber Physical Systems, but it's a similar idea.
Would be independent?
Yeah, right, so it would be independent and it would be largely expertise based, and so...
Apolitical.
Apolitical.
That's the problem I have with this. That we,
right, I see.
If we say that we have to politicize, we have an apparatus of collective intelligence,
right.
Democracy, to run through political debates and adjudicate them.
That's fair, Nico. I mean, you could either bring back OTA, or you could also beef up the Congressional Research Service. I mean, Congressional Research Service has written some amazing things about some of this stuff. Like, there's stuff on drones. I hope you agree. Like, Richard Thompson is fantastic, but they don't have the interdisciplinary chops that I think that they once did. And so I think that bringing back Congressional Research, OTA, these are other levers. Do you want to jump in with anything else on this provocative question?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is that you mentioned the earlier panel and the sort of similarities between this conversation and that one. And I think that the point that they made about bringing different voices into the conversation and the necessity of doing so, especially in regulating emergent technologies like this one, is one I definitely want to underscore. I think that instead of just traditional research arms or traditional regulators perceiving these questions and grappling with the implications of them, we find more than ever now a need for the entire government apparatus to come together to start thinking about not just the regulatory aspects of these issues, but the legal and policy implications. The data piece, like I mentioned before, is also an extremely important one. Standards bodies now more than ever play an extremely important role. That's something that the earlier panel spoke to as well in regulating policy and also in thinking about implications in a lot of these different applications.
Okay, so one more question, then we have to go to the next one. Thank you very much. Please, yep.
Sure. So I want to. Doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't know why that's off. Maybe our IT people could help, but yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to take the next step beyond the Volvo liability question. So I get that. I get, if you manufacture something, you're responsible. I understand that AI trying to get you to click on ads and stuff. You can obviously go after Google if something goes wrong. But beyond that, one day we'll get to this point where we have the single algorithm delivered to humans. It's blank, it grows with us, it learns with us, and it doesn't follow an objectives of the company who actually developed the algorithm. It follows your objectives, and that's it. When that thing learns something wrong, who do you go after?
Yeah, so to pursue that question, algorithms are always extensions of us. They don't have agency of their own. They're always acting on behalf of someone. So if your algorithm does something wrong, right, the first question to ask is, whose algorithm was it? Now, if let's suppose that I'm a company that just sold you an algorithm to do something and something bad happens. The question to ask to decide who's liable is, was it your objective for the algorithm that was wrong, in which case you're liable, or was it the way the algorithm executed it that failed, in which case I who built the algorithm am liable? The rather tricky question is I think the one that I brought up earlier, which is if the algorithm is learning by observing you, right, then who's liable? I think that part is genuinely murky, but I think what's going to happen is that we, as individuals, as a society, we are going to have to become aware that we are using a lot of these algorithms and that a lot of them are learning, and we need to be aware, as I am, for example, already, but most people aren't, that every time you interact with a computer system, you're teaching it. And so you have to realize that you could be teaching it bad things or right things, and then once people have this understanding, then they also become responsible for what they teach their algorithms to do.
Ryan, last word on this panel. Yep.
So there's a rich legal doctrine of principal agency. And you can take some of the concepts from that and ask, is there liability as the principal for the agent you're dispatching? There's also a rich body of law called products liability, and you can ask those same questions. Was the design in some way defective in permitting or enabling a dangerous activity? These existing bodies actually work quite well. It returns to what we want to do with liability. Do we simply want to express our outrage and move on? Do we want to incentivize appropriate behaviors? If so, there are other mechanisms to achieve that, including as these machines get more sophisticated, simply acting directly upon them through code. And then finally, is it compensation? And insurance is actually a part we haven't talked about, but belongs in these conversations for all of those reasons. For its regulatory role, for its compensatory role, and ultimately for its role in giving some space for enabling this kind of innovation and taking some of the thorny questions out of liability.
Okay, so I am going to set up the last conversation of the night. But before I do that, sorry, there's no more room for questions. I'm so sorry I did not get to yours. But I'm going to set the last panel of the night. But before I do that, please join me in thanking this great panel. Thank you guys. I'm now going to invite John Markoff and Ed Felton up here, and I'm going to move us around a little bit. Thanks again. And so we're going to talk for a little while about next steps and reflections, and then there is a reception just down the hall that I hope that you can all join us for in room 117. Is that correct? And it's just that room 116? 15. I knew I'd get it eventually. I did not know that. Yeah. But in room 115. So after this, we'll go directly to that. So I have a couple of nameplates for us, and then we'll turn it over to you, John. Thank you so much for being here. By the way, of course, John Markoff is a reporter for the New York Times and the author of the book I mentioned, Machines of Loving Grace, which I highly recommend as authoritative on the history of robotics and artificial intelligence. Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you, and I know our time's short, so why don't we get started? Ed, could you take us into the process by which the OSTP decided to go down this path?
Sure. I think there were a few factors that came together that led to the decision to launch this initiative. One was an observation that these issues around AI and machine learning were popping up all over the government, and that there was an opportunity to get better coordinated in terms of how we address them. That's number one. Number two is a huge increase in the amount of discussion of these issues that was happening in the public eye, and that was both in terms of some of the specific near to medium term policy issues, as well as some amount of chatter about some of the farther out scenarios. And so that public discourse was important, and some concern about some very serious issues around jobs and the economy, and so on. And it also seemed that in the ongoing discussion that was driven by the big data process that started a few years ago and that's still going on, that the discussion around those issues was turning more to AI and machine learning. And so as a way of building on what I think is the success of that in public engagement, we were interested in rolling it out more broadly. And so we had a conversation within OSTP, within the White House, and there was general agreement that this was a good thing to do.
Did the president get involved?
The president certainly knows what we're doing.
Was this driven by John Holdren, the president? I mean, how does it work within OSTP?
I mean, it is a sort of consensus process. I mean, we know who the boss is, right? If the president said, or Dr. Holdren said, no, I don't think this is a good use of your time, we wouldn't be here. But it is a process that really, I think, is driven by a conversation within OSTP.
So I'd like to ask you about sort of your perspective on rate of change. Going way back to the genetic engineering community in 1975, that group of scientists literally called a halt. At Asilomar in 1975, they paused doing research while they're thinking about things. And then, I guess it was in 2009 when Eric Horvitz was the president of AAAI. They met at Asilomar, and ultimately they decided it wasn't cause for pause. And now here we are 6 years later. If the computer science community was back at Asilomar, do you think that things would be different?
I could only guess. My sense is that the conversation would be different, but probably the bottom line outcome would be similar. That my sense is that there was at that time recognition that there were some very important ethical issues, that there were some important issues about safety that this technology raised, but that the community felt at the time that the right path was to keep moving ahead with the research to try to get ahead of the problems instead of trying to stop the field. And my guess is that if the AI community got together today, they would get to, I think, pretty much the same outcome. I think there would be a better understanding of these issues that's developed over time, a clearer picture of the road ahead, but still, my sense is they would still move ahead with eyes open.
If Oren represents sort of the community's perception on whether this is an existential threat or not, I was wondering, we have this rapid increase also in the world of biotechnology. We now have CRISPR and gene drive on the horizon that come very quickly. Are you thinking about going down a similar kind of path and thinking about them where there pretty clearly is an existential threat, an immediate one, perhaps?
Yeah, I think certainly if it became evident that this technology was likely to pose a very serious threat imminently, then the thinking might be different. And obviously, one of our jobs as a government is to be aware of the development of the technology and to be alert for situations where a change in policy is really merited. And so one of the things, part of this initiative is to make sure that we have an ongoing capability to engage with this technology and to make sure that we're hearing the best information from the AI community about what's going on.
We're talking about the issue of regulation within government, but also there's this question of industrial policy. And you said something very interesting, but subtly in your opening remarks, and that is that you believe that AI would create jobs, but it also would displace, and the word you used was some jobs, which I think neatly framed where you're looking at this from. And it's very much in, I think, the mainstream economics community would agree with you. However, if you went to Silicon Valley and you talked to Larry Page or Ray Kurzweil, that would not be the consensus. There is, I think, a view in Silicon Valley there's going to be a rapid destruction of jobs. But what if it's somewhere in between? What if what happens, and I think this was brought up, what if what happens is this downward ramp and de-skilling of jobs and this creation, what if, right now in America we have more people working than ever in history. But what happens if they're pushed down the economic ladder because of technology? Where would it be right for government to step in, and what would the industrial policy look like?
Well, I think this is a version of a question that we are already dealing with and have been dealing with for some years, which is the way in which technological change affects the distribution of jobs that are available. We heard some discussion earlier today pointing back to the agricultural revolution, in which there was a big change in what Americans did for work, from being mostly agricultural workers to mostly not. And as those sorts of transitions happen, especially when they're driven by technology, if you get to a position where the new jobs require different skill sets than older jobs, then that is going to cause displacement. It's going to cause pain. And the policy response to that is to do several things. First of all, it is to make sure that we're training young people in the right way, that we're educating young people for the life that they're going to live in the future, that we are doing what's necessary to train people, the people who have been displaced, to try to help give them the skills they need to do the jobs that are available, and ideally to move up the ladder of skill and salary. And then to make sure that we have the right policies in place to deal with the pain, the dislocation that will happen. It is a policy issue we've been dealing with, and but it's not new in that sense.
The government regulates food. They regulate toxic chemicals. A range of things. But AIs, is it too early to? I mean, is regulating an AI a fundamentally different thing than regulating any other product? What happens, for example, 3 of our major technology companies are designing systems that are conversational systems that interact with us. They're acting like humans. They're acting like citizens. Is there a difference?
Well, I think, first of all, the regulatory system tends to change in a fairly deliberate way. The regulation that we see today is the application of regulatory authorities that have existed traditionally, and that makes sense, right? The DOT, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, or NHTSA, has regulatory authority to regulate and responsibility to regulate auto safety. And that is true regardless of who's driving the car, whether it's a person or whether it is autonomous or semi-autonomous. The details of how to carry out that regulatory authority and responsibility may differ. And it's important to keep to make sure the regulation adapts as the conditions change. And so there's a set of regulatory areas in which the arrival of AI changes the way regulation may operate, but the fundamental purpose of the regulation and the way that the authorities and the institutional structures and agencies making the regulations, the way all of that operates, is adapting rather than being rebuilt from scratch. I don't think we're anywhere near the point where we would talk about sort of broad regulation of AI for all applications. It still makes sense to apply existing law. Privacy laws apply. Consumer protection laws apply. If you have AIs that are doing things like financial trading, all of the consumer protection and financial market regulation structures still apply. So there is a robust regulatory structure, but it is really more traditional in its nature.
How challenging is it that the government may have cross purposes here with respect to AI? Pedro just gave a ringing endorsement of what he called intelligence. I think they're mostly referred to as autonomous weapons. But it's been quite striking in the last 3 months, maybe a little bit longer, that the Department of Defense has made artificial intelligence the actual centerpiece of our national defense strategy. And Robert Work recently has been talking specifically about machine learning as a key component to our national security strategy. Are we going to be in a situation where we're going to have AI for good and AI, if you will, for bad at cross purposes?
I don't think so necessarily. A lot of what DoD does is, a lot of the activity of DoD, even in wartime, has to do with logistics and protection of civilian populations and so on. There are these difficult questions about autonomy in weapons. And I think DoD has been very responsible in dealing with those issues and setting up a policy. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the international humanitarian law and all of the legal and treaty obligations apply. There's no exception for those in those for autonomous weapons. You can't say, well, it was just the AI, right? DoD is responsible, and military forces are responsible for making sure that there's an appropriate level of human control in all of those systems. How to put that into practice as new systems are built is not so simple. But it's important to recognize DoD does a lot of things. They do logistics, they do intelligence, a lot of things other than just shooting. And AI will have an important role to play, I think, in a lot of those parts of the mission.
It's come up in a couple places today, just a very broad question about whether or not government can keep up. It's been sort of suggested that technologies outrun government. Do we need to do anything structural? I mean, there were some suggestions made. Do you agree with some of the ideas about sort of adding new bodies or retrieving old bodies to allow us to cope with technology?
I mean, I think there's two ways to look at that. One is the question of how you can make sure that the right expertise and the right people are involved in the decision-making process, that the decision makers who are chosen by the people ultimately have the advice they need in order to make good decisions. And so one question is how you make sure that that can happen. And the other question is, what are the institutional structures that you build in order to institutionalize that behavior? I think we're seeing progress, certainly within the executive branch, which is what I see most closely. I think we're seeing a lot of progress in increasing the amount of technical expertise and the precision with which it's applied. We have a long way to go. It's a constant issue across all kinds of different expertise. But I do think this is one of the things I think that this administration has recognized, maybe more so than past administrations. But this is a constant issue to work, and I've been relatively impressed by what I've seen within the executive branch generally, as far as this goes.
One of the things you said at the very outset that really intrigued me was the possibility of using AI in government to improve the quality of government. Are there some sort of specific examples that come to mind about?
Sure. I mean, there's a bunch of examples that have to do with how government is able to provide services to people. The government provides health care for a lot of people, veterans, for example. And there are opportunities to provide that in a better way. And that means not only doing a better job with things like diagnosis, but it also means doing a better job of identifying issues before they arise. And that's not just physical health, it's mental health issues. Being able to better predict, for example, which service people returning from overseas are likely to need counseling, are likely to need more counseling, or are likely to need other kinds of support. We think generally that there are a lot of opportunities in the parts of government that provide support for people who need special help for one reason or another, that the opportunity to identify and find those people and to offer help and to offer intervention where it's welcome is a big opportunity. And so many opportunities to do those things. We saw a cautionary tale, we've seen a cautionary tale in the press about the use in the criminal justice system. But nonetheless, there are opportunities in criminal justice as well, if these technologies are applied in a really responsible way to reduce the burden that system places on people while making sure that people are kept safe as well.
I'm cutting into the reception time, but maybe let me ask, and maybe I can bring you in, Ryan, too, just as well. You know, one of the things in terms of regulation, and some of this has been discussed by the lawyers today, when things fail, and you can figure out why they failed, and it's all pretty straightforward, but from talking to some of the computer scientists who are here today, you know, there are probably maybe a dozen companies in Silicon Valley right now who are trying to build self-driving car companies around machine learning. And they're using deep learning techniques and neural net techniques. And my understanding is that in many cases, we don't understand how those algorithms are making decisions at this point. How do you regulate when you don't know what's going on under the hood?
Well, let me just thank you again for this. It's been extremely stimulating, and so appreciate you being willing to answer the questions, and John, for you to pose them. It's a great way to wrap up this event. And it's true, we are standing between people and drinks, and that's always a dangerous thing. Maybe what I'll just say in brief response is that, in a sense, the question of whether or not we can regulate artificial intelligence is not, in my view, from a legal perspective, the exact right question, right? The question is, what kinds of things can artificial intelligence do, and what kind of phenomenon will they occasion that will pose interesting challenges for the law? For example, the law cares a lot across many different domains about whether or not a particular person or entity is in control of a system, right? You have to have effective control of an employee. You have to have effective control of a ship at maritime law. You have you have to have effective control of an instrumentality of injury in tort law. And there's a serious question about whether or not, for certain artificial intelligence systems, a human has effective control over that system. And that question may reverberate across the law. Similarly, whether it's criminal law or tort law, we want to look for a person intending whatever the outcome happened to be, or at least foreseeing it. And so if a crime is committed by a person, we ask questions about, did they do this on purpose, so-called mens rea, the intending mind. But if you have the prospect of activity that if it were done by an emergent AI system, that if it were done by a person, it would be a crime, but if it's done by that system, it lacks mens rea. That's interesting. Or it's interesting that you might have an outcome that is truly emergent, that was not foreseeable by anybody involved in the interaction, and that causes ordinary principles of tort liability breakdown. So for me, it's not about there's this thing called AI, we could regulate it, right? It's rather there is the set of technologies that occasion behavior that we really haven't seen before, at least by a machine, and that raises interesting legal puzzles. I don't know if that's a helpful response to your earlier question or not. Ed, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I'm not going to give a legal answer, not being a lawyer. No, I'm not going to try to design a regulatory regime up here. But I think the question of how do we know this thing is safe is a question that we know how to ask. And as a technical matter, we have a general idea of what the evidence for safety could look like. And Bryant talked about this on the previous panel, the idea that of putting together a case for the safety of a system and needing to argue from evidence that something is safe. And so what is that evidence? It could be evidence based on technical analysis of the design. It could be evidence based on safety technologies that are built in. That's sort of the AI watching the AI, or technology watching the AI approach. It could be evidence based on a pilot project or some sort of testing in a lab. But it's a question that, as a technical matter, we know how to ask. How to turn that question and the knowledge that the field is still building about how to build and evaluate safety cases, how to turn that into a regulation or a legal regime, I'll leave for better minds to discuss over drinks.
Okay, great. That's a great place to. So thank you so much, everybody.